I'm Tyler Bennett, and I was 18 the night I finally understood what my place was in my family. 2 days before my birthday, I texted my older brother and asked if he could at least make it to dinner. He sent back 3 words: "Not in the mood." That was it. No joke, no excuse, nothing after. I stared at my phone for a while, still telling myself my parents would show up. They had to. It was my 18th birthday. I wasn't asking for a huge party or some expensive gift. I just wanted one dinner where I didn't feel like an afterthought. I waited anyway. I sat in that restaurant by myself, watching families come in, laugh, order food, sing for somebody else's kid. Every time the door opened, I looked up. Every single time, it was the wrong person. After 40 minutes, my phone finally lit up. It wasn't an apology. It was a short message telling me something had come up at home and I shouldn't make a big deal out of it. That was the moment something in me went cold. I paid for my own birthday. Dinner, went back to the house, packed a duffel bag, grabbed my documents, and left before sunrise. Nobody came after me. Nobody called to ask where I went. A year later, when they suddenly wanted me back in their lives, they acted like I was the one who walked away for no reason. Before I tell you why they came looking for me, take a second to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy real family drama stories with twists that keep getting worse the deeper you go. The truth is that birthday dinner didn't come out of nowhere. By then, being invisible in that house had already been my normal for years. My brother could ruin a whole week, and somehow the entire family would reorganize itself around his mood. I could keep my head down, do everything right, and still end up treated like the least important person in the room. Turning 18 just stripped away the last excuse I had been making for them. That night didn't break my family. It exposed what my family had already been for a long time. A lot of things looked normal from the outside. If you had driven past our house in Columbus, you probably would have thought we were one of those steady, middle-class families that never had real problems. My dad worked hard, my mom kept everything looking put together. The lawn was trimmed, the cars were clean enough. And every year we put out Christmas lights right after Thanksgiving, like we were following some invisible suburban rule book. We had dinners at the table often enough for other people to picture us as close. We showed up for holiday photos. We sent out graduation cards. We said the right things around neighbors. Inside the house, though, everything bent around my older brother. His name was Logan, and for as long as I can remember, he was treated like the center beam holding the family up. If he had a good day, everyone relaxed. If he had a bad day, the whole house shifted to accommodate it. He didn't even have to ask most of the time. My mom, Brenda, could sense his mood from the way he closed a cabinet. My dad, Mark, could hear one sharp answer from him and decide the rest of us needed to give him space. I learned that early enough that it stopped surprising me before I was even a teenager. Logan was 3 years older than me, which meant by the time I started noticing how things worked, he already had years of practice being the one everyone revolved around. When he was little, that probably started with normal stuff. He was the first kid, the first report card, the first soccer team, the first one to bring home a girlfriend, the first one my parents could pour all their hopes into. Somewhere along the line, that normal first child attention hardened into something else. He wasn't just loved more in the obvious ways. He was given more room to fail without consequences, more room to speak harshly without being corrected, more room to disappoint people while still being protected from the cost of it. I was the opposite kind of kid, which didn't help me. I wasn't difficult. I wasn't loud. I didn't break curfew because I almost never went anywhere worth breaking curfew for. I did my homework, I washed my dishes, I kept my grades decent, and I figured out pretty quickly that needing less didn't earn you more in our house. It just made you easier to ignore. Nobody ever said that out loud, of course. Families like mine almost never do. They don't sit everyone down and announce the hierarchy. They build it quietly through 1,000 small choices, then act offended if you notice. If Logan forgot something important, it became a family emergency. If I needed something, it became a lesson in patience. If he snapped at someone, he was under pressure. If I had an attitude, I was being disrespectful. The pattern was so consistent, it stopped feeling like a pattern and started feeling like weather. You didn't debate it. You just lived under it. Some of my earliest memories are tiny enough that they would sound ridiculous if I listed them one by one, but that's how this kind of thing works. A lot of family damage isn't one explosive event at first. It's repetition. It's watching the same outcome happen so often that you stop hoping for a different one. When I was 8, I entered a school art contest because my teacher pushed me to do it. I wasn't some prodigy, but I liked drawing, and I took it seriously. The judging night happened to fall on the same evening as one of Logan's middle school basketball games. My parents talked about how busy the schedule was, how they'd try to split up, how they didn't want either of us to feel unsupported. I remember thinking that meant one of them would be with me. Instead, both of them went to his game because it turned out his team was playing a rival school, and Dad said those games got intense. Mom promised they'd ask me all about the contest when they got home. I came home carrying a ribbon for second place and set it on the kitchen counter. Logan's team had lost, and everybody was talking like there had been a death in the family. Dad was irritated at the refs. Mom was annoyed because the drive back had taken too long. Logan threw his bag down and disappeared upstairs. Nobody asked how my night went until the next morning, and by then Mom made it sound like forgetting was a simple scheduling issue rather than a choice. That was one of the first times I understood something. I would keep learning for the next 10 years. The level of support I got depended less on what mattered to me than on whether it interfered with what mattered to Logan. As we got older, the gap became harder to excuse. Logan wasn't one of those straight-A golden boys who made everyone proud because he actually did everything right. In some ways, that would have been easier to accept. He was good-looking in the easy, natural way that made adults forgive things before he even opened his mouth. He could be charming when he wanted something. He could make a joke at the exact moment tension built up and reset the entire room. Teachers liked him until they had him long enough not to. Coaches said he had potential. Girls liked him. Friends came in and out of his life constantly because people got pulled in by the version of him he showed in public. At home, he was different. Not dramatic in some movie villain way, just deeply used to being buffered from consequences. He left messes for other people. He borrowed things and returned them late or not at all. He spoke to our mother with a flat impatience that would have gotten me grounded for a week. He argued with our father like they were equals, then somehow walked away without losing anything. Every time he hit a wall, my parents rushed in like they were handling a crisis instead of a grown pattern. Mom always had an explanation. Logan was stressed. Logan was misunderstood. Logan had so much pressure on him. Logan didn't respond well to criticism. Dad's version was simpler. He believed Logan had drive and that people with drive were rough around the edges. He liked to say some version of boys mature late, as if maturity were a weather system you simply waited out instead of a character issue you addressed. By the time I was 12, I had stopped taking that stuff personally in the open. That doesn't mean it didn't hurt. It just means I understood there was no point in reacting every single time. If I did, then I became the problem. Mom would get that tired look and say she didn't have the energy for another fight. Dad would tell me to stop keeping score. Logan would smirk like I'd proved something useful for him. So I learned to shut up. That became my role. The easy kid. The reasonable one. The one who could understand. The one who could wait. The one who didn't need much. Families like mine love that kid because he makes their imbalance cheaper to maintain. There were bigger moments too, the kind people would actually recognize as unfair without needing the whole backstory. One winter, Logan backed Dad's car into a mailbox while trying to leave too fast for a date. He came back furious mostly because the bumper was scratched and he thought Dad would overreact. Instead of making him pay for the repair or lose driving privileges, Dad spent the evening talking him down and saying accidents happen. The next weekend, my phone bill ran a little high because I had forgotten to switch off cellular data one month, and suddenly I was getting a lecture about responsibility waste and respect for money. Another time, Logan missed an important school deadline because he waited until the last minute to fill something out, then expected Mom to fix it. She called the office, called another parent, called one of his teachers, and spent half the day trying to untangle it, while he sat at the kitchen table acting irritated. I forgot one permission slip for a field trip and was told I had to accept the consequences and learn from it. That phrase came up a lot with me. Learn from it. Logan rarely had to learn from anything. He had handlers. What made it harder was that there were moments, especially when I was younger, when he could be decent. Not warm exactly, but not openly cruel either. He would throw me a ride sometimes if it was convenient. If one of his friends made fun of me in front of him, he might tell them to knock it off, not because he cared how I felt, but because he didn't like outsiders messing with his family. Those scraps of normal behavior kept me confused longer than they should have. They made me think there was some better version of him underneath the entitlement, and maybe if life settled down, maybe if stress went away, maybe if our parents stopped treating him like everything depended on him, he'd act like a brother. That version never showed up when it mattered. The older he got, the more obvious it became that my parents had built him into someone who expected accommodation everywhere. By the time he was in high school, he treated every inconvenience like a personal insult. A coach criticizing him, a girlfriend breaking up with him, a teacher giving him a grade he didn't want. Traffic making him late. His friends changing plans, Dad questioning one expense too many, it all landed the same way. The world had failed to meet the standard of comfort he assumed was his by default. When he graduated, my parents acted like it was a turning point. Dad kept saying college would straighten him out. Mom said he just needed direction. For a while, I think they both believed that because they needed to. Parents will tell themselves almost anything if the alternative is admitting they helped create the problem. Logan went to a local program for a while, changed his mind, dropped classes, picked up work here and there, then quit or got bored. Every time he stalled out, the house entered another period of emotional weather adjustment. Mom would tiptoe around him. Dad would get stern for half a day, then back off when the conversation turned tense. Suddenly, grocery money, gas money, phone bills, and little emergencies started attaching themselves to my brother like burrs. Dad would complain privately to Mom about it, but the checks still got written. Mom would tell me not to judge him because everyone finds their path at a different speed. Apparently, Logan's speed was allowed to be indefinite. Meanwhile, I grew into the age where adults start praising you for being self-sufficient in ways that are really warnings. Teachers liked me because I turned things in. Neighbors liked me because I was polite. If someone needed help carrying something dog-sitting for a weekend mowing while they were out of town or assembling cheap furniture from a flat box, I was the obvious person to ask. I started making little bits of money doing that kind of stuff and held on to it carefully because I liked the feeling of having something that was mine. Even then, the family logic found ways to follow me. If I had money saved from birthday cards or odd jobs, Mom might suggest I contribute toward takeout when the house felt strained. If Logan was short on gas, somehow, it was always framed like helping him out would be a mature thing to do. If he needed a ride because his car situation got messy again, people assumed my time was more flexible, even when it wasn't. No one held a gun to my head. It was softer than that. It came dressed as understanding. It came in the voice of family. It came wrapped in phrases like, "Just this once he's had a rough week, don't make this bigger than it is." The problem with hearing that your whole life is that one day you realize they can fit almost anything inside those words. My relationship with Mom changed the most as I got older. because I got old enough to recognize what she was doing. As a kid, her softness worked on me. She wasn't loud. She didn't slam doors. She didn't openly insult me. She made casseroles, folded towels, remembered dentist appointments, and knew how to sound hurt when anyone challenged her. It took me years to understand that not all manipulation is aggressive. Some of it comes in the shape of disappointment. Some of it is a sigh and a careful voice asking why you can't just make this easy. Some of it is a woman looking exhausted enough that you feel cruel adding your needs to the pile. Mom wasn't evil. That would make the story too simple. She loved the version of family she could present to herself. She just loved peace more than fairness, and peace in our house usually meant giving Logan what he wanted fast enough to prevent a scene. If fairness got in the way of that fairness, lost. Dad was easier to read. He respected strength, or at least what he thought strength looked like. Logan's confidence, even when it was misplaced, impressed him more than my reliability did. Dad didn't dislike me. I want to be clear about that. This wasn't a cartoon where one child was treasured and the other was openly hated. It was worse in a quieter way. I was valued right up until valuing me required anyone to inconvenience Logan. Then my needs became negotiable. When I was 15, I got offered extra hours helping a man down the street with minor repair jobs on a rental property he owned. Nothing huge. Painting trim, carrying supplies, pulling old carpet, cleaning out units between tenants. I liked it immediately. It was hard work, but it made sense in a way school sometimes didn't. You could look at something damaged in the morning and see progress by evening. The owner was blunt and not especially warm, but he paid on time and didn't treat me like being young made me useless. That work gave me my first real glimpse of a life outside our house. Not freedom in some dramatic runaway sense, just evidence that the world was bigger than our kitchen table and the moods that controlled it. I got better with tools. I learned how much people charged for labor. I learned the difference between people who complained about work and people who simply did it. More than anything, I learned that adults who weren't connected to my family often found me easier to trust than the people who supposedly knew me best. That should have made me feel proud. Mostly it made me angry in a way I didn't know how to use yet. At home, the same old structure stayed intact. Logan drifted in and out of jobs. Mom kept making excuses for him. Dad kept insisting things would turn around any day. If my brother stayed out late and slept half the morning, that was temporary. If I spent too much time working, Dad would ask if I was neglecting school. Logan came home irritated and was left alone because he needed decompression. I came home quiet and got asked what my problem was. There were nights at dinner when I barely spoke because I knew the conversation would become about Logan by the second or third sentence anyway. If he was there, the room leaned toward him. If he wasn't there, the room talked about him. Mom worried over him. Dad criticized him in that frustrated way fathers do. When criticism is really concern they refuse to name. Sometimes they'd both turn to me and ask what I thought, as if I had been invited into a real discussion. It was never because my opinion mattered. It was because they wanted confirmation. They wanted me to say he was trying his best. They wanted the easy kid to help carry the emotional load again. When I didn't, the temperature changed fast. Around 16, I made the mistake of saying out loud that maybe nobody was helping Logan by rescuing him every time he messed something up. I didn't even say it dramatically. I said it while clearing plates after dinner because Dad was complaining about another expense and Mom was defending my brother again. You would have thought I'd slapped somebody. Mom went silent in that wounded way she used when she wanted the room to turn against me without her having to attack directly. Dad told me I had no idea what adult pressure looked like. Logan laughed under his breath and asked if I thought I was some kind of expert because I painted a few walls on weekends. That was the first time I remember looking around the table and realizing there was no version of honesty that would ever land safely for me. in that house. If I stayed quiet, I stayed useful. If I said what I saw, I became disrespectful. After that, I started planning in the small, unglamorous ways people actually plan to leave difficult homes. I paid more attention to how much things cost. I kept my important documents where I could get to them. I stopped assuming home would be my safety net after graduation. I picked jobs and hours based not only on money, but on what skills might matter later. I didn't make a dramatic vow to disappear one day. I just stopped building my future around the idea that my family would act like one. That didn't mean I stopped wanting them to. That was the humiliating part. For all the resentment I carried, some part of me still wanted a normal family moment badly enough to keep getting hurt by the absence of one. You can know a pattern intellectually and still hope the next time will break it. Especially around birthdays, holidays, graduation, the usual milestones people are told will mean something. As my 18th birthday got closer, that old hope came back stronger than I wanted to admit. Turning 18 mattered to me more than I let on. It wasn't about becoming some totally different person overnight. It was about crossing into an age where leaving no longer sounded like a fantasy. It was about being able to open my own account, sign my own lease if I ever got there, make choices without every conversation ending in "because you live under this roof." I didn't need a giant celebration. I didn't need gifts. I wanted one clean memory. One evening that felt like my family saw me without comparing me to the person I had spent my life standing next to. That was probably my mistake. A week or so before my birthday, Mom mentioned dinner in that casual way people do when they want credit for effort before they've actually done anything. She said maybe we could all go somewhere nice, not too expensive, just the family. Dad nodded while watching something on television. Logan was half listening from the kitchen, opening the fridge and shutting it again, like he was too burdened to decide what to eat. Nobody looked excited, but nobody objected either. I told myself that was enough. I picked a place that wasn't fancy, just somewhere decent where we'd gone before for birthdays and small celebrations. Nothing about it should have been difficult. For a couple of days, I let myself believe that dinner would happen, and that maybe this time I wouldn't have to lower the bar so far it was underground. Then Logan started having one of his weeks. That's what I called them in my head. Not because one specific disaster happened every time, but because the same energy took over the house. He got moody, short-tempered, hard to predict, and suddenly every conversation turned into a weather report about him. That week it seemed tied to some mix of money problems, bruised pride, and a fight he'd had with someone he refused to name directly. Dad asked one question too many about work and got snapped at. Mom kept going into Logan's room and coming back out with that careful face she wore when she wanted everyone else to tread lightly. Cabinets shut harder. Doors closed quicker. The atmosphere changed. I noticed it, but I still made the reservation. That alone says a lot about how strong denial can be when it's mixed with hope. I wasn't stupid. I knew what that house was like when Logan decided the world had wronged him. I knew every plan became fragile when he was in a mood. Still, I told myself that 18 was different. I told myself they would get through one dinner. I told myself that because accepting the opposite felt pathetic. The day before my birthday, Mom asked if I was sure I wanted to keep the reservation. Not because she thought I deserved better, but because she was already managing his emotions in advance. She said things had been tense and maybe a quiet dinner at home would be easier on everyone. Easier on everyone almost always meant easier on Logan. I said I still wanted to go out. Dad didn't weigh in. He just looked annoyed that the question existed. I texted my brother the next afternoon anyway, not because I thought my invitation would transform him into a decent person, but because I wanted there to be no excuse later. No revision where he could say nobody told him. I kept it simple. "We're still on for dinner tonight, right?" He didn't answer for a while. When my phone finally buzzed, the message was short enough to feel insulting on sight. Not in the mood. That was the whole thing. No punctuation, no explanation, no effort. I looked at it for a longer time than I should have, then put the phone down and got ready anyway. Because stupidly, embarrassingly, some part of me still believed my parents would show up even if he didn't. I thought maybe they'd finally choose the child whose birthday it actually was. I thought maybe the pattern had limits. I had spent years misunderstanding what the limits were. That answer settled something in me. I didn't throw my phone. I didn't text back. I didn't try to argue anybody into caring. I went to dinner, sat through the humiliation of being the only person at a table meant for 4, and by the time I drove home, I felt strangely calm. Not better, not numb exactly, just finished with a certain kind of waiting. The house was quiet when I got back. Mom's car was in the driveway. Dad's truck was there too. So was Logan's beat-up sedan. For a second, I just stood in the dark driveway with my keys in my hand, looking at all 3 vehicles and thinking about how absurd that was. They had all been home, not stuck in traffic, not at the hospital, not pulled into some emergency they couldn't control. Home. While I sat in a restaurant by myself on my 18th birthday, I let myself in as quietly as I could. The television was on in the living room, volume low. My father was asleep in his recliner, with one arm crossed over his stomach. My mother had left a lamp on near the hallway. Logan's bedroom door was closed. There was a plate in the sink with sauce dried onto the edge, another in the dishwasher, and the smell of takeout still hanging in the kitchen. That detail hit harder than almost anything else. They had eaten dinner, together, at home, without me. I remember setting my keys down on the counter and just looking at the sink for a few seconds. There wasn't some dramatic confrontation in that moment, because nothing was left to uncover. The whole thing had already been explained more clearly by a dirty plate than any speech could have managed. I went upstairs, shut my bedroom door, and sat on the edge of my bed. Then I pulled a duffel bag from the closet and started packing. I took what mattered first. Jeans, work shirts, socks, underwear, my heavier jacket, a few old hoodies, my sneakers, my phone charger, the envelope with my birth certificate and social security card, and the small amount of cash I had in the metal box under my desk. I grabbed my toothbrush, some deodorant, and the cheap shaving kit I barely used. I took the notebook where I'd written down hours, jobs, addresses, and numbers over the past year. Then I stopped and looked around my room. It was a teenager's room in the least sentimental way possible. Nothing in there felt worth making a second trip for. A desk I didn't own. A dresser older than I was. Posters I had stopped noticing years earlier. School books. A lamp. A laundry chair with clothes thrown over the back. I realized most of what I was leaving behind wasn't really mine in any way that mattered. I wrote a note because it seemed cleaner than disappearing without one. I kept it short. I'm leaving. Don't worry about where I am. I'm safe. I'm taking my things. I'm not coming back this time just because everyone decides to act normal tomorrow. Then I looked at that last sentence for a second and crossed out this time because it implied there had been other times, smaller versions of this, and I didn't want to explain anything for them. I rewrote the line without it and left the note on my pillow. After that, I sat back down, not because I had doubts, but because leaving at 18 sounds bigger when you are actually doing it than it does in your head. I remember listening to the house settle around me, hearing the refrigerator hum downstairs, hearing somebody cough once through a wall, and thinking that if I stayed until morning, there would be a conversation. There would be reasons, tones, deflections, guilt, and that old pressure to help them return everything to its usual shape. If I wanted out, it had to be now. So I carried my bag downstairs, put on my jacket, and left before sunrise. Nobody stopped me. Nobody heard me. Nobody came out onto the porch. I drove to a 24-hour gas station a couple of miles away and parked under the lights near the side of the building. I bought a coffee I didn't really want, and sat in my car while early commuters started passing through the intersection. I still had some money from work, but nowhere near enough to pretend I had a real plan. I knew a few practical things. I knew which places hired fast. I knew which parts of town had weekly motels. I knew one landlord who occasionally rented furnished basement rooms month to month. I knew enough to understand that none of those options were good, but one of them would have to become good enough. I texted the only adult outside my family I thought might answer that early. His name was Greg Dalton, and at that point he managed a building supply warehouse where I had picked up part-time work a few months earlier. He wasn't warm and he didn't invite personal stories, but he respected effort, and he picked up his phone when people called for a reason. He answered on the third ring, sounding half awake and immediately irritated. I said, "Sorry to call this early. I know it's a bad time. I just needed to ask if you knew anyone renting a room cheap, even temporary." There was a pause. Then he asked, "You in trouble?" I said, "Not legal trouble." Another pause. "Can you be at the warehouse by 7? "Yes." "Then be there. Bring whatever you've got with you." He hung up. That was all. No sympathy, no 20 questions, no speech about responsibility, just instructions. At the time, it felt almost cold. Later, I understood that his kind of help worked because it came without theater. I got to the warehouse before 7 and waited by the loading bay with my duffel at my feet. Greg rolled in a few minutes later, carrying a paper cup and looking exactly like a man who had no interest in being dragged into teenage family drama before sunrise. He glanced at the bag, glanced at me, and said, "You look terrible." "Thanks." "You eaten?" I shook my head. He jerked his chin toward the break room and told me there were vending machines and stale donuts left over from a rep visit the day before. I grabbed one because my hands were starting to shake a little, and I didn't want that to become noticeable. Once we were inside his office, he sat down, leaned back, and asked the kind of questions that mattered. Did anyone know where I was right now? Did I have my documents? Did I have money? Was I dropping out of school? Was anybody likely to call the police and claim I'd been taken or hurt? I answered him straight. He nodded through most of it, then wrote down the number of a man named Carl, who rented basement rooms to warehouse workers now and then. He also said I could pick up extra shifts for a while if I showed up on time and kept my head clear. "It won't be comfortable," he said. But comfortable's not on the menu at 18. That was probably the closest thing to kindness he knew how to say. Carl's place was on the west side of Columbus, in a tired split-level house with mismatched blinds and a chain-link fence that leaned in one corner. He rented out the finished basement room to men who were between places, recently divorced, working 2 jobs, or otherwise trying not to drown in public. The room itself had a narrow bed, a lamp, a dresser with one drawer that stuck, and a little half window near the ceiling that showed only ankles when people walked past outside. It smelled faintly like detergent and concrete. It was also affordable by the week and available immediately. I paid for the first 2 weeks in cash and moved in that same afternoon. Mom called while I was carrying my second load of things down the outside basement steps. I watched her name light up on my screen and let it ring out. Then Dad called. Then Mom again. Then Logan, which almost made me laugh. I ignored all of them and kept moving. By the time evening hit, my room at Carl's place looked like a storage closet with a pillow, but it was mine in the only sense I cared about. Their messages started after that. Mom's first voicemail sounded more inconvenienced than scared. She asked where I was and said leaving a note like that was dramatic. She said if I needed space, I should have acted like an adult and talked to them. Dad's message was shorter. He said I had until that night to come home before I made the situation worse. Logan didn't leave one, which fit him perfectly. He texted once, "You seriously doing this?" I didn't answer. That first week was held together by caffeine embarrassment and logistics. I still had school during the day, still had shifts at the warehouse or side jobs when they came in, and now had rent due every week, whether I felt emotionally prepared or not. There was no room for collapse because collapse cost money. That ended up helping me more than any motivational speech could have. Mornings started early. I'd shower fast, make coffee with the cheap machine downstairs, eat whatever I could afford, and get out before Carl started one of his stories about ex-wives or tax law. Classes felt unreal for a while, like I was participating in a version of normal life I no longer belonged to. Then after school, I'd head straight to work, move pallets, unload trucks, stock inventory, sweep, or ride along when Greg needed an extra set of hands for deliveries and pickups. By the end of the second week, exhaustion had become my baseline. It was physical, which was easier than what I'd expected. I thought I would be crushed by loneliness or second-guessing. Instead, what I mostly felt was pressure. Bills, time, gas, food, laundry, getting enough sleep not to make stupid mistakes. Real life came at me in such plain, repetitive terms that there wasn't much room left for melodrama. That didn't mean my family disappeared. Mom kept calling every few days at first, usually at times that implied she expected me to pick up privately, like late evening or during lunch. Her texts cycled through concern, disappointment, and guilt. She said things like, "We can work this out. Your father is upset. This isn't how families handle problems, and you're making everything harder than it needs to be." Not once in those early messages did she say she was sorry they missed my birthday. Not once did she say what they'd actually done. The omission was so total, it almost impressed me. Dad's communication was more direct. He wanted a location. He wanted me home. He wanted to know who I was staying with. He wanted to remind me I was still in high school and too young to think I understood consequences. Under different circumstances, some of that might have landed. At 18, with a basement room and a job and rent due, his warnings sounded less like authority and more like a man losing the ability to define someone else's reality. I answered exactly one text after the first week, and only because I wanted a line in the sand. I wrote, "I'm safe. I'm working. I'm not coming back." Mom replied within a minute, asking if we could meet for coffee and talk calmly. Dad followed with a message saying this didn't need to become a permanent stain on the family. I put the phone face down and went to bed. Life narrowed after that in a way I had never experienced before. People talk about freedom like it's a wide-open thing. The first version of it I got was narrow and practical. Freedom looked like buying my own detergent. It looked like counting the cash in my wallet twice before pumping gas. It looked like deciding whether eggs or bread could wait another 2 days. It looked like nobody walking into my room without knocking, and also nobody caring whether I had dinner. There was a cost attached to every bit of peace. Still, the peace was real. Nobody at Carl's place monitored my moods or demanded I participate in some emotional weather system built around a person who wasn't me. Nobody asked me to be understanding on command. Nobody expected my patience as a family resource. I could come in tired and remain tired without having to turn it into a service for someone else. That was new enough to feel almost suspicious. Greg became more important over those first couple of months than either of us probably intended. He wasn't a mentor in the sentimental sense. He didn't sit me down and teach life lessons. Mostly, he just kept giving me work when I did the last job right. He noticed things, though. If I was late once, he'd ask why. If I looked like I hadn't slept, he'd point it out. If I handled a customer well, he'd grunt like maybe I wasn't useless after all. In that environment, approval didn't come wrapped in words. It came as trust. One afternoon after a delivery, he asked if I had ever considered doing more than warehouse shifts. I said I'd done minor repair work for someone down the street from us before I moved out. Painting, flooring, prep hardware installs, cleanup, little things like that. He nodded and told me one of the warehouse clients needed extra labor on apartment turnovers and handyman calls. Nothing glamorous, just patching drywall, hauling debris, replacing fixtures, reattaching trim, fixing cabinet doors, and making a place rentable again, without paying licensed contractors for every tiny issue. "You want more hours," he said. "Learn things people pay for." So I did. That work changed everything slowly, which is the most believable way life changes. It wasn't one big break. It was a series of useful days. I learned how long things really took. I learned which shortcuts came back to bite you. I learned how tenants could destroy a place in ways that seemed almost creative. I learned how landlords cut corners when they thought nobody would notice. I learned to rehang doors, repair loose tile, replace cheap light fixtures, patch walls well enough that only someone looking hard could tell. I got better with tools, better with measurements, better with keeping track of supplies and invoices. Most importantly, I started seeing a path, a realistic one. Not fame, not some giant leap. Just the possibility that if I kept showing up, kept learning, and didn't let people drag me backward, I could become the kind of man who didn't panic over every weekly expense forever. That thought carried me through a lot. School remained its own problem. I finished what I needed to finish, but by that point, I was moving through those months with a split mind. Half of me was getting through classes because that was the responsible thing to do. The other half was already out in the working world, measuring apartments, hauling old sinks, and figuring out what kind of caulk worked best in kitchens that saw too much moisture. It sounds unromantic because it was. It was also the first time in my life my effort seemed connected to real outcomes. My family hated the distance even when they pretended they were simply concerned. Mom tried softening first. She sent messages asking whether I had enough blankets when the weather turned colder, whether I was eating properly, whether I needed money. That last one almost got me. Not because I wanted the money, but because for a second it looked like care. Then the second text came in the same thread asking if I could at least stop making things so awkward and come home for Sunday dinner. The offer had strings attached before I even answered. Dad moved between anger and negotiation. He talked about pride appearances and how this reflected on all of us. That told me more than he realized. I had not become more important to him because he missed me. I had become inconvenient because other people had started asking questions. Why wasn't Tyler around? Why hadn't anyone seen me at home? Why had I been working so much? What had happened? Oh. Logan made less contact, but each message carried the same energy disbelief that I was forcing everyone to react to my decision. He texted things like, "Mom's freaking out, Dad's pissed, you proved your point and stop dragging this out." It fascinated me that even in his version, the main event was not that they had left me alone on my birthday and expected me to absorb it. The main event was that I had refused to reset the stage for them afterward. That taught me something else early. Some people do not care what they did. They care what your response costs them. I kept working. The room at Carl's eventually stopped feeling temporary. I bought a second set of sheets. I picked up a little desk from a thrift store and sanded one leg until it stopped wobbling. I found a better coffee mug at a garage sale. I started using a laundromat closer to the warehouse because the machines were cleaner. I figured out which grocery store marked down chicken late in the evening and which gas station sold drinks cheap enough that grabbing one didn't feel stupid. A life assembled itself out of routines before I noticed that was happening. The first real sign that I was stabilizing came when I stopped checking my account balance every single day. The second came when Greg recommended me directly to one of his clients for weekend turnover work without shadow supervision. That mattered. In our line of work, your name moved only if somebody believed you wouldn't embarrass them. I got 2 units done over a long, miserable weekend and handed the keys back with everything cleaned up, functioning, and documented. The client barely looked at me, which in that business was almost a compliment. He just said Greg had been right, and there'd probably be more if I wanted it. I wanted it. By early spring, I had enough work stacked up between the warehouse and side jobs to start thinking beyond weekly survival. That was when I made the decision to leave Carl's and find a place that felt less like shelter and more like an adult life. I wasn't ready for anything fancy. I found a small one-bedroom apartment in an older building on the north side with thin walls, unreliable heat, and a landlord who believed fresh paint fixed almost everything. The rent was higher but still manageable if I stayed disciplined. When I signed that lease, I felt something I had not expected. Not triumph, relief. It wasn't a glamorous milestone. The carpet was worn. The cabinets looked older than my parents'. The bathroom fan made a grinding sound for the first 10 seconds after you turned it on. But it was my name on the lease, my key in the door, my place to leave and return to. Nobody could tell me to pack up because their feelings were hurt. Nobody could force a family conversation on me in the kitchen because I lived under their roof. Moving in took almost nothing because I owned almost nothing. A mattress on the floor at first, a folding table, 2 kitchen chairs that didn't match, dishes from a thrift store, 1 pan, 2 plates, a set of cheap towels, and a lamp Greg found abandoned near a loading dock and told me to take if I wanted it. I cleaned the place twice before the first night because scrubbing an empty apartment somehow made it feel legitimate. I didn't invite my family to see it. I didn't tell them the address. That turned out to be one of the smartest decisions I made. A year does strange things to pain. It doesn't erase it. It reorganizes it. By the time the weather warmed again and my 19th birthday got close enough to notice I wasn't waking up angry every day, I wasn't replaying the dinner in my head every night either. What had happened no longer felt like an open wound. It felt like a set of facts I had built around. My family had shown me what I was to them when comfort and convenience were on the line. I had believed them left and made a life anyway. That was when they started paying attention in a different way. It began with my mother changing tactics. The guilt softened into friendliness. Instead of asking when I was coming home, she asked how work was going. Instead of accusing me of making things hard, she said she hoped I was taking care of myself. Dad stopped texting for a while altogether, which usually meant Mom was trying to handle something before he made it worse. Logan went quiet too. At first I thought maybe they had finally accepted reality. Then I noticed Mom had started asking questions she didn't really have any reason to ask, unless she was gathering information. Was I still at the warehouse? Had I finished school? Was I living alone now? Did I have enough room where I was? The questions were casual on the surface, but underneath them, there was a purpose. I knew that tone from years of living in the same house with her. Mom never reached for details unless she was building towards something. A few days later, she asked if we could meet. Not to apologize. Not to talk about my birthday. Not to say she was sorry they had all stayed home while I sat alone in that restaurant. She said she missed me and wanted to discuss something important face to face. That was when I understood my family hadn't come back because they had changed. They had come back because they needed something again. By early summer, my phone had gone quiet enough that I stopped expecting trouble every time it lit up. That was probably why my mother's message landed the way it did. It didn't sound dramatic. It didn't sound urgent. It sounded almost normal, which made me trust it even less. Hey Tyler, I was near your side of town today and thought about you. Hope work is going well. Let me know if you have time for coffee this week. I read it once, set the phone down, finished my dinner, then came back and read it again. A year earlier, a text from her could ruin an entire night. Back then, one message was enough to drag me straight into the old mental routine where every word had to be decoded and every silence meant something. Now it felt more like someone rattling a locked doorknob. I still didn't ignore it. Part of that was caution. Part of it was curiosity. My mother had never been casual without a reason. Even when I still lived at home, she always approached difficult conversations from the side. If she wanted something uncomfortable, she softened her voice before she said it. If she expected resistance, she came wrapped in concern. A lot of people would call that tact. Growing up with her taught me it was strategy. I answered the next morning and kept it short. I can do 15 minutes after work on Thursday. She replied almost immediately, like she had been waiting for it. Thursday is fine. There's a place on High Street. You used to like their blueberry muffins. That line irritated me more than it should have. It was such a small, deliberate reach for familiarity, the kind of detail that was supposed to make me feel remembered. Maybe she did remember. Maybe she even meant it sincerely, in the narrow way people sometimes mean one soft thing while moving toward a selfish one. Either way, I didn't answer again. The coffee shop sat between my apartment and one of the properties I had been working on that week. I got there a few minutes late on purpose and saw her through the window before I walked in. She had already picked a table along the side wall, visible enough not to look secretive, tucked away enough to keep the conversation contained. She looked almost exactly the same as the last time I had seen her in person, which somehow made me more tense. Same careful hair, same neutral blouse, same composed expression that suggested she intended to leave the meeting looking reasonable no matter what happened. She stood when she saw me and gave me a small smile. "Hi, honey." I didn't hug her. I didn't even move closer than I had to. I sat down and said, "I've got about 15 minutes. Something shifted in her face at that not hurt exactly more like recalculation. She had probably imagined a softer opening. By then I knew better than to provide one for free. She started with the usual questions. How was work? Did I like my apartment? Was I eating enough? Was I sleeping enough? Was I taking care of myself? One by one they came out sounding harmless. Together they formed a performance of maternal concern that might have worked better if she had ever once started with the sentence I had needed a year ago. I let her get through a few minutes of it before I said, "What do you want, Mom?" She looked down at her coffee, then back up at me, with that expression she used when she wanted me to feel abrupt. "Can't I just want to see my son? You could have done that on my birthday." That landed harder than anything else I had said, mostly because it was so plain. She inhaled, pressed her lips together, and for a second, I thought maybe I was finally going to hear an actual apology. Instead, she said, "I know that night hurt you." "That was not the same thing," I said. "You still can't say it." "Tyler, you can't even say you were wrong. You can only say I got hurt." She folded her hands on the table. "I'm trying to have a real conversation with you." "No," I said. "You're trying to get past the uncomfortable part as quickly as possible so you can ask for whatever comes next." Her face tightened because that was close enough to the truth to bother her. She held my gaze for a second, then dropped the pretense. "Your brother is going through a difficult stretch," she said. There it was. I leaned back and let out one short laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable, it almost made the whole meeting feel scripted. "What happened?" I asked. "He's between places right now." That was a careful phrase. I waited. "It's temporary," she added. I said nothing. She kept going. "His lease situation became complicated and things at work are uncertain." That sounds like two separate problems. She gave me the look she used when I was supposed to feel cold for noticing obvious facts. Sometimes things pile up. In his life, they usually do. "Tyler, I let that pass." "So why are you telling me?" She hesitated just long enough to make the answer sound reluctant. "Because you have a place now. You're doing well. And I thought maybe just for a short while you could help him get back on his feet." I stared at her, even expecting an ask. I had not expected that one. My mother had spent a year avoiding any real accountability, then asked me to sit down for coffee so she could find out whether I would open my home to the same person my entire family had always centered at my expense. "You want Logan to move into my apartment?" "Only for a little while." I looked at her like she had switched languages halfway through the conversation. "Are you serious? He's your brother." And the word came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't take it back. A year earlier, I would have swallowed that tone out of habit. By then, I was too tired of the script. Mom lowered her voice, which always meant she was shifting into persuasion. "He made mistakes. So did you. I'm not offering you the spare key either." Her eyes hardened. "That's unfair." "No," I said. "It's accurate." She leaned in. You know this isn't how families are supposed to work." That almost made me smile because it was so familiar. She always spoke about family as if it were an ideal state I was responsible for restoring every time the people she favored damaged it. "You don't get to say that to me," I said. "Not after last year. It has been a hard year for all of us." I looked at her for a second. "You really believe that, don't you?" She didn't answer. I checked the time on my phone not because I needed to, but because I wanted her to feel the limit of my patience. "No," I said. "He's not staying with me. Not for a weekend, not for a week, not while he gets things sorted out, not in any version you're about to rephrase." Her eyes dropped to the table again. When she looked up, disappointment had replaced persuasion. "I thought living on your own would have made you more understanding. Living on my own made me more careful. That's a very cold way to talk about your brother." He wasn't worried about sounding cold when I sat alone on my 18th birthday. The thing about plain facts is that manipulative people hate them. They can work around emotion. They can work around anger. They can sometimes even work around tears by reframing them. Facts are harder. They just sit there. Mom shifted the conversation immediately. "He's had setbacks. You know how your father can be. Things have been tense at home too. We're all trying to find solutions." That was the first moment I understood the request was bigger than a couch for a few nights. If Logan had simply needed a temporary place because of one clean, simple problem, my father would not have sent my mother first to soften me. The careful approach told me they were already trying to manage more than they wanted to admit. "What happened with work?" I asked. Mom hesitated again. "He and his supervisor weren't seeing eye to eye." I almost laughed. "That sounds like he got himself fired. He chose to leave. Before or after they told him to." She gave me a warning look. "You don't know all the details." "I know enough." She kept talking anyway, maybe because she thought more information would create sympathy. It did the opposite. Piece by piece, it came out that Logan had been drifting again for months, missing shifts, blaming management, and acting like something better would show up before consequences caught him. Around the same time, the woman he had been seeing had ended things after they started talking about living together. The apartment problem followed that. Money had gotten messy. Then my parents had decided the answer was me. Not because I was the right choice morally, because I was the most convenient choice practically. I said, "Why me instead of you?" Mom's expression changed in a way that told me I had found the real pressure point. "Your father and Logan have been clashing," she said. So the house is not a good environment right now." That almost made me laugh again. The house had not been a good environment for me for years, but suddenly that mattered as a concept when Logan was the one who needed protection from it. "I'm not taking him. Tyler, please listen." I have listened. She lowered her voice even further. "He is embarrassed." I leaned in a little too. Good. That shocked her. Not because the word was harsh, but because it came from me. She was still adjusting to the fact that distance had changed what she could expect from me automatically. "He's family," she said again. "And I was family last year. You are still acting like everything comes back to one dinner." There it was. Clean minimization. Direct. Impossible to misread. I stood up. Mom looked startled. Then maybe because she thought we were still in the middle stage of the conversation, where she could recover it. "Sit down." "Number. Tyler, don't do this. I'm not the one doing it." A couple at the next table glanced over. I kept my voice level anyway. "You asked to meet because you wanted something. You still haven't apologized. You still think the main problem here is my reaction. He's not moving in with me. Your father is going to be very upset if you refuse to help." I looked at her for one quiet second. "Then he can be upset." I walked out before she could build another sentence around duty, forgiveness, or family. Dad called that night. He didn't bother with small talk. That was more his style. Once Mom failed at softness, he moved in as authority. I let the phone ring twice before answering. "What exactly is your problem?" he said without hello. I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at the wall. "Good evening to you too. Your mother asked for one small favor, and you treated her like some stranger trying to scam you. She asked me to let Logan move into my apartment. He needs a little help. He's had a little help his entire life. Dad exhaled sharply through his nose, the sound he made whenever he thought somebody else was being childish. You don't know what pressure looks like yet. That line had survived the years unchanged. I know what rent looks like, I said. I know what groceries cost. I know what it looks like when nobody bails you out. So maybe we define pressure differently. He ignored that. Your brother is going through a rough patch. He's always going through a rough patch. He had some bad luck. Did the bad luck make him lose his job and apartment at the same time? Dad's silence answered the question more clearly than words would have. I said no. Watch your tone. I'm watching the pattern. His voice hardened. You think you're better than everybody because you've managed 1 year on your own. No. I think I learned exactly what I had to learn. And what's that supposed to mean? It means the first time my life became inconvenient for you. You all let me sit alone on my birthday and acted like I was the dramatic one for leaving. Now he needs something, and suddenly I'm family again. Dad didn't answer right away, which told me I had cut across the line he least wanted named. When he finally spoke, he sounded colder. You are turning yourself into someone hard. That happened in your house. That's enough. No, I said. What's enough is you calling me like I owe him something because he ran out of people willing to carry him. He lowered his voice in that dangerous way fathers sometimes do when they think volume is beneath them and control should be enough. You will not talk about your brother that way. I just did. The silence after that stretched. I could picture him in the kitchen, one hand on his hip jaw, tight, trying to decide whether pushing harder would bring me back into line or make the whole thing worse. Finally, he said, "One day you may need your family too." That warning might have worked once. A year earlier, it would have. By then, all I heard was the assumption that family was a resource I was expected to protect, no matter how they used me. I already did, I said. That was the point. He hung up on me. Logan texted just after midnight. Mom said you were being a jerk. You seriously can't help me out for a little while. I read that and almost ignored it, but something about the wording irritated me. Even then, he had managed to cast himself as the reasonable person inconvenienced by my lack of generosity. I wrote back no. He answered immediately. That's insane. I put the phone down. A minute later, another text came in. You've got extra room. Don't act like this is some huge sacrifice. That told me he had not even bothered to ask about the facts of my life. He had built a version of my apartment in his head, probably from whatever my mother had said. In reality, my place was small enough that another person there for more than a weekend would have changed everything about how I lived. But the size of the apartment wasn't really the issue. The issue was that he still moved through the world, assuming other people's space-time and stability could be treated like extensions of his need. I typed, "Find somewhere else." He called me instead. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Are you serious right now?" he said. "Yes, it's temporary. That's not my problem." He laughed once, short and disbelieving. "You've been waiting for a chance to do this." "To do what?" "To hold something over everybody's head." I leaned back against the wall and closed my eyes for a second. "You think this is about revenge because that's how you think. It isn't. I don't trust you in my apartment." That made him go quiet. Then he said, "You really think I'm going to steal your stuff or something? I think you ruin every environment people rearrange for you." He swore under his breath. "You've always had this thing against me," he said. "Ever since we were kids." "That's not true. It is from where I'm standing. You were never standing where I was." There was another silence. Then he shifted tactics in a way that sounded so much like Mom, it made my skin crawl. "Look, I know things weren't perfect, but I'm asking for a little help. Dad's on edge. Mom's stressed. You know how the house gets." The fact that he could say that to me without hearing himself told me more than any confession would have. "Yes," I said. "I do know how the house gets." "Then stop making this harder." I let out one short breath. "You still think I'm the one making things hard?" "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you can't even hear yourself." His patience broke then. "Forget it." "Already there." He hung up. For the next few days, nobody contacted me. That would have been peaceful if I hadn't known my family well enough to understand silence often meant regrouping, not surrender. I kept working. That was the useful thing about adult life. Personal drama doesn't pause the practical side of it. A tenant had punched a hole through a bedroom door in one unit we were turning over. Another apartment needed all the old caulk cut out of the shower because mildew had crept into every seam. I spent 2 afternoons repainting trim in an older duplex where every wall had been coated too many times over too many years. Work grounded me because it refused to become symbolic. A wall either got patched right or it didn't. A fixture either worked after you installed it or it didn't. By the end of the week, the family pressure came back from a different direction. My Aunt Marlene called. She was Dad's sister, the one relative who usually stayed on decent terms with everybody by avoiding strong positions. If she was calling me directly, it meant the story had started moving beyond my parents' house. I answered because ignoring extended family creates its own problems. "Hi, Aunt Marlene." "Well," she said with a little forced cheer, "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten I exist. I've been working." "I hear that." That phrase put me on alert immediately. She went on, "Your mother says things are still tense." "Do they?" "Tyler." I waited. "She says Logan's fallen on a rough patch and that you've become very firm." There was a pause before very firm. I could hear her trying to stay neutral, which meant she already suspected she had not been given the full story. I said no to letting him move into my apartment. "Oh!" That one syllable did a lot. It told me she had probably been led to believe I had refused something smaller, vaguer, and easier to condemn. She cleared her throat. "Your mother made it sound like he just needed a little support." "He does. He can get it somewhere else." "Is your place very small?" That almost made me smile. Aunt Marlene had always had a practical streak that surfaced when the emotional version of a story stopped adding up. "Yes," I said. "And that's not the main issue." I gathered. I didn't fill the silence for her. Eventually, she said more quietly, "You know your father hates when family business gets around. He should stop creating so much of it." That got a dry breath of amusement out of her before she caught herself. "You sound older." I had to get older pretty fast. She was quiet for another second. "Your mother says you're still upset about your 18th birthday." There it was again. Still upset. As if the problem were my emotional shelf life, not the thing itself. "I'm not upset," I said. "I'm clear." That line stayed with me after I hung up because it was the most accurate thing I had said in weeks. A couple of evenings later, Greg noticed I was quieter than usual while we were loading trim boards into the truck for a small renovation job. "You look distracted," he said. "Family stuff," he grunted. "Family stuff usually costs more than money." "That sounds specific." "It is." We finished loading in silence. Once we were in the cab, he started the engine and said without looking at me, "Don't bring unstable people into a stable place unless you want both to become unstable." I turned that over in my head for the rest of the drive. Greg didn't pry. He didn't ask names. He just offered the kind of sentence you only get from someone who has watched enough people wreck their own footing out of guilt. By then, I had no intention of letting Logan move in, but hearing it from somebody outside the family helped. Families like mine train you to believe your boundaries are cruelty. The world outside that system often sees them for what they are, maintenance. 3 nights later, Dad called again, and this time he didn't bother with anger first. He sounded controlled, which was worse. "We need to talk in person," he said. "No, we don't." "Yes, we do. I've already given you my answer. This isn't just about the apartment anymore." That line changed the air around me. I said, "Then what is it about?" He paused for half a beat and answered in the most revealing way possible. "It's about you embarrassing this family." The thing about that sentence was that it didn't come out by accident. He meant it. Under all the talk about concern, rough patches, stress, and temporary help, there it was at last, image control, and the expectation found that my refusal was not only inconvenient, but publicly disloyal. I leaned back in my chair and looked out at the parking lot through my apartment window. "You should have thought about that before my 18th birthday." He exhaled hard. "I'm tired of you using that night as a weapon." I almost answered immediately, then stopped, because a different thought clicked into place. He wasn't tired of the memory. He was tired of the fact that I had one clean fact he could not explain away. Weapon was an interesting choice of word. I stayed quiet long enough that Dad filled the silence himself. You keep throwing that knight in everyone's face like it explains everything, he said. At some point, you either move on or you admit you enjoy punishing people. I looked at the dark window over my sink and watched my own reflection hold still in it. You're confusing memory with punishment. That's exactly what I'm talking about. No, I said. What you're talking about is the fact that I remember something you want treated like a misunderstanding. Dad let out a tight breath. I am done arguing about this over the phone. Then stop calling. He didn't like that. I could hear the shift immediately, the little edge of disbelief that always came out when somebody in the family failed to cooperate with the role he had assigned them. You've changed. That was the point. He ignored that. Your mother's trying. Your brother is in a bad spot. The least you could do is act like part of this family instead of standing outside it with a scorecard. For a second, I almost answered the way I might have answered at 16, trying to explain why the whole framing was false. Why? Refusing to set myself on fire for Logan didn't make me cruel. Why? Family wasn't supposed to function like a funnel that turned one person's need into everybody else's obligation. Then I remembered I had already had versions of those conversations for years. They never changed the result. They only gave the other person more material to twist. So I said, I'm going to bed. Dad's voice sharpened. Don't hang up on me. I ended the call anyway. That should have felt dramatic. It didn't. It felt practical, the same way locking your door feels practical when someone has made it clear they don't respect boundaries unless a physical barrier forces them to. The next several days moved with the kind of false normal that always used to make me uneasy as a kid. In our house, calm never meant resolution. It meant somebody was deciding which angle to try next. Apparently, adulthood had not changed that pattern. My phone stayed mostly quiet, but not in a peaceful way. More in the way air gets quiet before weather turns. I worked long hours that week, mostly in a row of older units a landlord was trying to refresh fast enough to rent before the next month rolled over. Everything in those apartments was tired in the same way. Cheap cabinets painted one too many times. Baseboards split at the corners. Closet doors that had never hung straight. Bathroom fixtures installed by at least 3 different people over the years, none of whom had cared enough to do the job right the first time. I liked work like that because it didn't pretend to be better than it was. The place needed repair. You repaired it. No emotional games, no hidden rules. By Friday afternoon, I had almost convinced myself my family had backed off because reality had finally settled in. Then my mother posted a photo on social media. She rarely posted much. That alone was enough to make me notice. It was a family picture taken years earlier at some Christmas gathering, one of those stiff, smiling group shots people keep, because deleting it would feel like admitting something ugly. The caption read, "No matter how hard life gets, family should still choose family." That was it. No names. No explanation. Just enough to look harmless to strangers and pointed to anyone who knew there was tension. Within an hour, there were comments from relatives and family friends saying things like praying for peace, hoping everything works out, and family is too important to let pride get in the way. I stared at the post for a long time before closing the app. That was one of my mother's talents. She could create social pressure without ever saying the thing directly. She didn't need to write, "Tyler is refusing to help his brother." She only needed to set the table and let other people season the meal for her. Anybody on the outside could read that post as a sweet message about sticking together. Anybody inside the orbit understood it as a public version of a private accusation. I didn't comment. That became another lesson after I moved out. Not every trap deserved the dignity of stepping into it. If I had replied even calmly, she would have gotten what she wanted, proof that I was reactive defensive, still emotionally available for the old push and pull. Silence frustrated people like my mother more than outrage did because silence denied them material. That didn't mean it didn't get under my skin. The next move came through text messages from relatives who had not reached out to me once during the year I spent building my life from scratch, but suddenly had opinions now that a dramatic version of family duty was floating around. One cousin asked if everything was okay between me and my parents. A great aunt I saw maybe twice a year sent a message about forgiveness being a sign of maturity. Even an older neighbor from the street where I grew up left me a voicemail saying my mother looked worn out and that sometimes boys don't understand what mothers carry. That one almost made me laugh. Nobody ever calls a man who leaves his son alone on his 18th birthday worn out in a tone that excuses his behavior. The language people use around women like my mother is softer, more forgiving, because their manipulation often arrives dressed as sacrifice. That doesn't make it less manipulative. It just makes it harder for outsiders to spot quickly. Aunt Marlene called again that weekend. This time she skipped the cheerful opening. "Your mother is being ridiculous," she said. I was in the middle of replacing 2 cabinet hinges in my own kitchen and had the screwdriver still in my hand. That sounds more direct than last time. She posted that thing online. I saw it. She's acting like she's heartbroken because the family's drifting apart. I set the screwdriver down. The family didn't drift. They pushed. Aunt Marlene sighed. I know. That surprised me enough to make me sit down. To be clear, Aunt Marlene was not the heroic truth-teller in our family. She had spent years staying neutral because neutrality cost less. But she wasn't stupid either. And sometimes, once a certain amount of pressure built up around a lie, even people who preferred the middle could no longer ignore where the weight really sat. She said, "I asked your mother what exactly she expected from you. And she did that thing she does where she starts saying nobody understands how much she worries." She didn't answer. No. Which is an answer. I rubbed a hand over my face. You know what they want. I've gathered enough. There was a brief pause. Then she said carefully, "Is it true Logan may have to move out of where he is by the end of the month?" I almost corrected her, then stopped, because the wording mattered. May have to move out suggested ongoing instability. Not one bad week. Not one fixed deadline. A mess with history. "I'm sure it's true," I said. "That still doesn't make it mine." "No," she said. "It doesn't. That mattered more than I expected." Not because Aunt Marlene's approval was some missing puzzle piece in my life, but because it was the first time anyone in the extended family had said the obvious thing out loud without decorating it. She added, "Your father's angry because he thinks this should all stay inside the house. Then he should stop dragging it through everyone else." Another sigh. "You know he'll never see it that way." "Then that's his problem." She laughed quietly at that, and for a second I heard something like respect in it. You really did get harder. I got clearer. After we hung up, I sat at my tiny kitchen table for a while and thought about the way families like mine build consensus. Not through truth, not usually. Through repetition. One person says the same framed version enough times, another person repeats the softened version, and by the time it reaches the edges of the family, it becomes accepted history. Tyler is difficult. Tyler is cold. Tyler is dragging this out. Tyler won't let old hurts go. The original event barely matters anymore. What matters is which summary gets repeated most. That was the week I started saving everything. I already had old texts from my parents because I never deleted much, but now I created folders, screenshots, voicemails, dates, notes on calls, not because I planned some theatrical reveal down the line, but because living around distortion teaches you the value of records. When a person rewrites reality often enough, documentation becomes emotional self-defense. I had another reason too. A woman named Allison Webb entered the story not long after that, and the moment I met her, I knew I was dealing with someone who had been fed the family-approved version of me. The first time I saw her, I didn't know who she was. I was picking up paint and fasteners from a supply counter near the front of the warehouse after finishing a delivery route. Greg was in the back, arguing with a vendor over a missing part. I had a cart with 2 boxes of flooring spacers, trim screws, painter's tape, and a gallon of primer when I noticed a woman by the service desk, glancing my way with the kind of recognition that suggested she knew me but wasn't sure whether to admit it. She was in her late 20s, maybe dressed in office clothes that had started to lose their neatness by the end of the workday. Not flashy, not timid either. The first thing I noticed was that she looked like someone who actually listened when people talked, which in my experience made her more dangerous than the obviously shallow type. People who listen well can also absorb lies more deeply if the liar knows what he's doing. When she finally stepped closer, she said, "Tyler." I stopped pushing the cart. "Yeah, I'm Allison." She waited half a second, probably expecting the name to click. It didn't. Seeing that she added, "I'm with Logan," that explained the recognition. I kept my face neutral. "Okay?" For a second, she looked thrown by how little reaction she got. Then she smiled in a way that felt polite rather than warm. I wasn't sure if I should say hi. "You just did." That came out drier than I meant it to, but I wasn't sorry. She wasn't the problem, at least not yet, but I also wasn't interested in pretending we had stumbled into some sweet family crossover scene. She nodded once and tucked a piece of hair behind her ear. "Right. Sorry. I've heard a lot about you." I believed that immediately. "Have you?" I said. Something in my tone must have registered because she shifted her weight. "I didn't mean that in a bad way." "Then you probably heard a different version than the one going around." That made her blink. Not offended, just alerted. I wasn't trying to start anything. "I know. I almost left it there. I should have, probably. But curiosity got the better of me." "How long have you been with him?" "A little under a year." That meant she had arrived after I left the house, which made things simpler and stranger at the same time. She had never known me as part of the family structure. Everything she knew about me had been handed to her second-hand, almost certainly by the three people least qualified to describe me honestly. I said, "Then I guess you met the edited version of this family." She frowned slightly. "What's that supposed to mean?" Before I could answer, Greg came back up front carrying a clipboard and gave me the look he used when he thought personal conversation was slowing down work. "You loading that stuff or writing a memoir?" I grabbed the receipt. "Loading it." Allison stepped aside, but before I pushed the cart away, she said, "Logan didn't know I'd run into you." That was an interesting detail to volunteer. I said, "Good for him." Then I left. The encounter stayed with me longer than I expected, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because of the look on her face when I said edited version. It wasn't outrage. It was uncertainty. Most people fully committed to someone else's lie meet contradiction with instant defense. Allison had looked more like someone who had discovered a crack in a story she had assumed was stable. 3 nights later, she called me. I almost didn't answer because I didn't have her number saved, and I was elbow deep in a half-eaten takeout container at my kitchen table, but something made me pick up. "Hello." "Hi," she said, sounding more hesitant than she had in person. "It's Allison. From the warehouse." "I remember." "Okay. Good." I wasn't sure if this would be weird. "It depends on what you want." There was a pause long enough to tell me she was deciding how honest to be. "I wanted to ask you something, and I didn't want to do it in front of Logan." That sharpened my attention immediately. I said, "Go ahead." She exhaled. "Is it true that your parents didn't come to your 18th birthday dinner? Straight to it. No lead-in, no social cushioning." That made me respect her more than I wanted to. "Yes," I said. Another pause. "And you left that night?" "Yes." "Why was I told you stormed out over a misunderstanding and cut everybody off because you've always held grudges?" I leaned back in my chair and let that settle. There it was. Clean enough not to require interpretation. Logan and my parents had not simply softened the story. They had built an alternate one where my leaving was evidence of instability, not the consequence of being ignored. "Because that version works better for them," I said. She was quiet for a second. "Then Logan said he texted you that day to tell you he couldn't make it, but your parents were still planning to be there." I almost laughed, but it came out more tired than amused. "He texted me 3 words. Not in the mood." My parents never showed. The only message I got from them while I was sitting there alone told me not to make a big deal out of something that had come up at home. She didn't interrupt. I continued, so if you're asking whether I moved out because of one random miscommunication, no. I moved out because it wasn't random. That's what I started wondering. What changed? She hesitated again. The details keep moving. That was so precise it could have come out of my own head. What details? At first it was that you were distant and hard to reach. Then it was that you got angry over the dinner. Then your mom said you'd always resented Logan and took the first excuse to leave. Then your dad said you'd changed after getting some independence and started acting above everybody. The story never lands in the same place twice. I looked at the mess of receipts on my table and felt a grim kind of satisfaction. People who lie consistently often believe variation makes them harder to catch. In reality, variation is what gives them away to anyone paying close attention. So why are you asking me instead of them, I said. Because when people tell the truth, they usually don't need that many versions. That answer made me sit with the phone in silence for a moment. Then I said, "What does Logan need from me now?" She didn't ask how I knew there was an angle. A place to land, mostly. Mostly, she heard the emphasis. And maybe help getting back on track. I laughed once quietly. There it is. You expected this. I grew up in it. She let that sit. Then she said carefully, "For what it's worth, I don't think he's telling me everything." That was not the same as being on my side. It was better in a way. Sides come with their own pressure. Doubt was enough. Doubt meant the family narrative no longer had perfect control. "I'm not asking you to pick a team," I said. "I know, and I'm not having him in my apartment." I figured. We ended the call a minute later, without anything close to warmth, but also without hostility. Afterward, I stood at my sink, rinsing out the takeout container and thinking about how long it had taken for someone near Logan to notice that the story around me didn't hold together. The next escalation came from my mother again, because of course it did. She left me a voicemail 2 days later, her voice strained in a way that sounded partly sincere and partly performative. And the dangerous thing about people like her is that those two states often overlap until even they can't tell where one ends. "Tyler, I don't appreciate you creating confusion with Allison," she said. She came to me asking questions that were deeply upsetting to this family. "If you have something to say, you should say it to us directly, instead of spreading your bitterness to people who don't belong in this." I listened to that message twice. The language fascinated me. I had not contacted Allison. I had not sought her out. I had answered direct questions honestly. Somehow in my mother's version that became me creating confusion, which really meant this: I had disrupted narrative control. Dad texted half an hour later, "Stop talking to people about private family matters." I wrote back, "Then stop lying to them." He did not respond. That night, Logan called from an unfamiliar number, which was exactly the sort of thing people do when they know you might stop answering theirs. I picked up because sometimes the fastest way to understand the current state of a situation is to hear the person losing control try to recover it. "What did you say to Allison?" he asked. "No, hello? Don't play games with me." I leaned against my counter and looked at the wall clock. I answered a question. She thinks I lied to her. Maybe work backwards from there. He swore, then lowered his voice. "You are making me look bad for no reason." That sentence almost deserved a trophy. The lack of self-awareness was so complete it became its own art form. "No reason," I repeated. "Sure, you know what I mean. I actually don't. She doesn't need to hear every grievance you've been saving up since high school." I didn't give her every grievance. I gave her facts. He made a sound of disgust. "You always do this. You take one thing and stretch it into a whole indictment." The word indictment stuck with me because that was exactly how he heard accountability. Not as consequence, not as honesty, but as a hostile legal brief prepared by someone unfairly obsessed with him. I said, "Your problem is that the facts are connected." "My problem is that you're bitter." "No," I said. "Your problem is that bitterness is the only reason you can imagine for someone refusing to protect your image." He didn't answer that right away. Then he said, voice hardening, "You think because you've got your own place and a few steady jobs, you can sit in judgment over everybody. I'm not sitting in judgment. I'm saying no to family. You only use that word when you want access to something." The silence after that was different from the others. Not empty. Calculating. It was the kind of silence people make when they are deciding whether to escalate or retreat. When Logan spoke again, his tone had gone strangely flat. "You should be careful, Tyler." I straightened a little. Is that supposed to mean something? It means not everything needs to get ugly. I waited, but he didn't clarify. He just disconnected. For a while after that, I stood in my kitchen listening to the refrigerator hum and feeling the old family pressure shift shape again. Up until then, the whole thing had still lived mostly in the realm of emotional coercion, social pressure, and narrative manipulation. Ugly was a different word. It implied action, not just persuasion. The next morning, I backed up my phone. Then I printed out the screenshots I had been saving. Then I bought a small lockbox. Those were not dramatic actions. They were boring, which is usually how real self-protection looks. You save records. You make copies. You stop assuming instability will remain verbal just because it started there. At work that week, I was quieter than usual enough that Greg noticed. He didn't ask immediately. He waited until we were finishing out a long day at a duplex, where one tenant had left behind broken dining chairs, a stripped ceiling fan, and a bathroom cabinet hanging off one hinge. We were loading the truck in the fading light when he said, "You've got the look." "What look?" "The look people get right before they let family chaos walk through the front door dressed as obligation. I snorted despite myself. "That's specific, huh? I'm old," he said. "Patterns repeat." He shut the truck door and glanced at me. "You let the wrong person get comfortable in your space, you won't just lose space. You'll lose peacetime money and the version of yourself that built the place to begin with." I nodded once. He studied me for a second. "You already know that." "Yeah, then act like you know it." That was one of the things I appreciated about Greg. He never confused sympathy with usefulness. He wasn't there to tell me my family was terrible in some satisfying emotional way. He was there to remind me that bad decisions still counted as bad decisions, even when guilt made them feel moral. By the end of that week, Allison called again. This time her voice sounded sharper, less hesitant. "Logan told me you reached out to me first." I almost smiled. That would be impressive considering I didn't know who you were at the warehouse. That's what I thought. I sat down at my kitchen table and rubbed my thumb along the rim of my mug. "What happened?" She exhaled. I asked simple questions. Nothing dramatic. The answer changed 3 times in one evening. "Then your mom said I was putting strain on a family that was already suffering." There was a dry note in her voice when she said suffering, and I asked, "And I'm starting to think your family uses that word whenever they want someone to stop asking for details." That was probably the most accurate description anyone outside the house had ever made about the Bennett family. "I'm sorry you got dragged into it," I said. She laughed once, though there wasn't much humor in it. "I'm less dragged into it than I was invited into a lie, and noticed the furniture didn't match." That line stayed with me. We didn't talk much longer after that. There was nothing to resolve yet. But by the time I hung up, I knew one thing clearly. Whatever hold my parents and Logan usually maintained through consensus had cracked, and cracks change the behavior of people who depend on control. I could feel it happening already. The pressure was no longer just about getting me to comply. It was becoming about punishing me for not protecting their version of events. By then, the pressure had changed shape. It stopped feeling like a family argument and started feeling like interference. The first sign was small enough that I almost dismissed it. I had a Saturday turnover job lined up through one of Greg's regular clients, a landlord named Jonah Pierce who owned a handful of older duplexes and small rental houses around Columbus. Jonah was not easygoing, but he was fair in the narrow businesslike way that mattered to me. If he gave you work, it meant he believed you would finish it without excuses. If you wasted his time, you didn't get a second chance. I liked that about him because it made everything simple. Do the job well, and more work follows. do it badly, and it doesn't. That Friday night, he texted to confirm I could start early the next morning at one of his properties on the east side. I answered yes, set my alarm, and went to bed. When I got there a little after 7, the front door was unlocked, and another truck was already parked in the driveway. At first, I thought I had the wrong address. Then I saw 2 guys carrying out old shelving through the side gate. Neither of them was anyone I knew. One of them asked if I was with the clean-out crew. I said no, I was supposed to be handling the patching and fixture replacement inside. He frowned and said the owner's son had called the night before and told them to bring in an all-in-one crew because the schedule had changed. The owner's son. Jonah didn't have a son involved in the business. I stepped away from the porch and called him immediately. He answered, sounding annoyed before I even finished saying hello. "Tyler, where are you?" "At the house on Bexley. There's already a crew here." "What crew?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out." There was a long enough pause on his end that I knew he was putting pieces together fast and not liking what he saw. Then he said, "Stay there." He arrived 20 minutes later in a dark SUV, got out already angry, and started asking questions before he had fully closed the door. The crew leader showed him a text thread from a number he assumed belonged to someone authorized. According to the messages, the work order had been expanded, the keys would be available in the lockbox, and the owner wanted one invoice for everything. It was sloppy. Not completely impossible, but sloppy enough that Jonah's irritation turned into something sharper. He pulled me aside near the fence and said I never sent that. I figured. "You tell anyone about this address? Number. Anybody know you were working for me tomorrow?" The answer came into my head before I wanted it there. Maybe. I didn't say Logan's name immediately, because saying it out loud made the thing feel less theoretical. Up until then, most of my family's damage had lived in conversation, social pressure, and story control. Interference with paid work belonged to a different category. Jonah watched my face for a second and said, "You have someone in your life who likes to make problems." That was a statement, not a question. I said, "Possibly." He looked like he wanted to ask more, then decided against it. "Business first." He sent the crew away after making it clear they were not getting paid by him, resecured the lockbox, and told me to get started inside while he changed codes and called his property manager. I worked the job through anyway, but the rhythm of the day was gone. Every few minutes I found myself replaying the same chain of thought. Someone had known the address. Someone had known the timing. Someone had been willing to create confusion around a job that paid me. That didn't prove Logan had done it. It did prove one thing: I could not ignore the ugliness he had hinted at over the phone no longer sounded abstract. When I got back to my apartment that evening, my phone showed 1 missed call from my mother and 2 texts from Logan. First one, "You still being weird about everything." Second one, sent an hour later. "Guess some people make work their whole personality when they don't have a real life." I read both, said nothing, and took screenshots before doing anything else. That became my habit from then on. Not because every text was incriminating on its own, but because context matters over time. People like Logan count on each individual thing looking too small to defend against. A comment here, a call there, a coincidence with just enough deniability to make you sound paranoid if you connect the dots too early. I didn't answer him. The next incident came 4 days later and felt even harder to dismiss. I had a small evening estimate scheduled with a woman who had been referred to me by one of Jonah's tenants. Nothing major, just some trim replacement, a closet door track, and a bathroom vanity that needed to be resecured before she listed the condo for sale. I wasn't yet at the stage where I could casually lose potential clients. Every estimate mattered, because every estimate might become a paid week, and every paid week built the next one. I got there right on time, knocked and waited. No answer. I checked my phone to make sure I had the correct unit number, then knocked again. Still nothing. I was about to leave when the woman opened the door with a face that was already closed off. "You're late," she said. I looked at my phone. "No, I'm not. We said 6. Her expression hardened. "You changed it to 5:30. I stared at her. I didn't. She held up her phone, and there on the screen was a short message thread confirming an earlier time from a number that was not mine, but signed with my first name. Same tone I might use if I were trying to sound brief and professional. No glaring errors, just enough to work. I said, "That's not my number." She looked from me to the screen and back again. Suspicion gave way to irritation of a different kind. Then who have I been talking to? That was the right question, and I had no clean answer ready. I showed her the messages from my actual number, including the original time we had agreed on. She let me in after that, but the damage had been done in a way I hated. Even when a misunderstanding gets cleared up, something remains. A client who starts off confused is already partly braced against you. I did the estimate anyway and stayed calm, but when I got back to my truck, I sat there with both hands on the steering wheel for a full minute. 2 incidents in 1 week. Both attached to work. Both dependent on access to information that should not have been floating around widely. Both constructed to create confusion without clear fingerprints. I called Greg that night. He listened without interrupting while I laid it out. When I finished, he said, "Have you tightened up your information?" What does that mean? It means stop assuming people only know what you tell them directly. Old paperwork. Client sheets in the truck. Property addresses on the passenger seat. Unlocked phone. Anybody seeing a calendar notification over your shoulder. Casual conversation in a supply line. It doesn't take a genius to make a mess if you leave enough scraps around. That stung because he was right. I had become more careful emotionally than practically. I was guarding my boundaries but still moving through work with habits built during less hostile months, when my biggest problem was overbooking myself and forgetting to eat lunch. "I can fix that," I said. "Fix it tonight." So I did. I password-locked everything that wasn't already locked. I moved client notes into folders that stayed with me, not loose in my truck. I changed how I labeled addresses. I stopped leaving paper estimates visible. I turned off preview notifications. I backed up my phone again. Then I sat at my kitchen table and made a written list of every suspicious contact, altered message, odd overlap, and inconvenient accident from the previous month. It looked worse on paper than it had in my head. The problem with lists is that they remove your ability to pretend something is isolated when it isn't. A few days after that, Logan came to my apartment. He didn't call first. I was upstairs carrying in a small box of cabinet pulls and switch plates when I saw his car parked along the curb. For a second, I just stood there on the landing keys in one hand, hardware box in the other, and felt the old family pressure surge through my body, the way it used to when someone unexpected raised their voice at home. Then it settled into something colder. He was leaning against the hood like he had every right to be there. I walked the rest of the way up without speeding up or slowing down. "How did you get this address?" He shrugged. "You live in one city, Tyler. It's not exactly a spy mission." That answer told me enough. Either he had gotten it through our mother asking the right kind of questions, or through one of the relatives, who now knew roughly where I was, or by following me. None of those possibilities improved the situation. "You need to leave." He gave a short laugh. "Good to see you too." "I mean it." He looked tired in a way I hadn't seen much growing up. Not humbled, just frayed. His clothes were clean but careless, and there was something off in the rhythm of him, like a man trying to act normal, while resentment kept catching on everything around him. "I just want to talk. You've had a phone for years." He ignored that and glanced toward the building. "Nice place." "It's small, still better than what I'm dealing with." I said nothing. He looked at me for a second, then pushed off the hood and stepped closer. "Look, things got out of hand." "Did they?" "Yes, with work too." That checked him for half a beat. It wasn't much, but it was there. He recovered fast. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Then you came all the way here to discuss what?" His jaw tightened. "You've got this whole narrative in your head, where I'm behind every problem in your life." "No," I said. "I have a timeline." That irritated him, because people like Logan prefer accusations they can mock to records they can't easily predict. He ran a hand through his hair and changed tack. "Mom's a mess," he said. "Dad's impossible to be around. Allison's asking weird questions. Everybody's on edge because you won't let anything go. I let that sit for a moment. Interesting definition of cause and effect. See that? Everything with you is courtroom language now. It's called clarity. He took another step closer. You think you're better than all of us because you made it a year on your own. That line would work better if none of you were still trying to use what I built. He looked toward my apartment door again. I'm not trying to use you. You're standing outside my building after showing up uninvited. His mouth flattened. I needed to see if you were really going to keep doing this. Doing what? Making me the villain. That was the first time he had said it so directly, and hearing it actually helped. It clarified the shape of his thinking in a way none of my mother's softer language ever could. Logan did not hear my refusal as boundary. He heard it as character assassination. In his mind, my saying no converted him from misunderstood to condemned, and that was intolerable because his whole life had trained him to expect protection from exactly that kind of emotional exposure. I'm not making you anything I said. I'm refusing to cover for you. He stared at me, breathing a little harder now. You've always hated me for being the one people paid attention to. That line would have hit me harder years earlier. By then it sounded almost sad in its transparency. I hated what the house turned into around you, I said. That's not the same thing. For a second, his face did something I wasn't expecting. Not remorse, not even understanding. More like he had heard a sentence he could not immediately flatten into the old categories. Then the expression vanished. You know what he said, backing up half a step? Forget it. Enjoy your little kingdom. He got into his car and left. I went upstairs, unlocked my door, stepped inside and checked every room out of instinct, even though I knew he had never gotten in. Then I set the hardware box on the counter and realized my hands were shaking. Not from fear exactly, from recognition. That encounter was not a plea. It was an inspection. He had come to see my place, my life, my setup to measure the thing I had built without them. People like Logan don't always need your permission to invade a space psychologically. Sometimes seeing it is enough for them to start imagining how to disrupt it. The disruption showed up 2 weeks later. Jonah had a bigger opportunity coming through, the kind that mattered to me because it would move me from odd jobs and scattered repair work into something closer to consistent project-based income. One of his contacts had bought a small duplex that needed quick but careful prep before refinancing and listing one side. Not a full renovation, more like a tight schedule of practical improvements. Doors adjusted, bathroom fixtures replaced, damaged trim, removed and reinstalled, minor patching lighting, swapped kitchen hardware, changed walls, cleaned and painted where needed, then final cleanup. The money wasn't life-changing, but the trust behind it mattered. Jonah met me at the property on a Tuesday morning and walked me through his expectations. He was blunt as always. Keep it clean. Keep it on schedule. Don't disappear. Don't make him chase me for updates. If I handled this right, more would follow. I said yes to all of it, because I knew exactly what it represented. 3 days into the job, my truck wouldn't start. At first, I thought the battery had died from age or bad luck. Then I noticed the passenger side door wasn't fully latched, even though I was careful about that. I opened it and saw papers shifted around a tool pouch unzipped, and one of my estimate folders half out from under the seat. Nothing major missing. Not at first glance. Just touched. That feeling is hard to describe if you haven't experienced it. When your private working space has been entered but not trashed, the violation gets into your system in a strange way because there is so much room for doubt, and yet almost none where it matters emotionally. You know. Even if you can't prove every detail, you know. I checked under the hood with a neighbor from the building who knew a little more about engines than I did. The battery cable had been loosened enough to fail intermittently. That could have happened accidentally. It also could have been done in less than a minute by someone who wanted me delayed without announcing themselves. I got the truck running eventually, but I was late to the duplex by almost 2 hours. Jonah wasn't there when I arrived, but he called before lunch, asking why one of the vendors he had scheduled showed up before I did. His tone wasn't explosive, which was worse. Disappointment from a man like him carried more risk than anger. I told him the truth in the smallest shape I could. Vehicle problem, delay, back on track now. He didn't yell. He just said, "I need reliability, Tyler." I know. That sentence sat in my chest the rest of the day. I stayed late trying to make up time, got home exhausted, and found a voicemail from my mother. "Your father heard you're working nonstop again," she said. "He thinks you're running yourself into the ground out of stubbornness. None of us want to see that happen." I listened to it twice, then deleted it from the main inbox and kept the saved file elsewhere. That line "your father heard" bothered me more than it should have. It meant they were still collecting information indirectly. Not enough to be specific, just enough to keep inserting themselves into my routines in ways designed to remind me that privacy around family was always conditional if they wanted something badly enough. The next blow landed where it hurt most: reputation. The condo estimate I had almost lost to the altered appointment message called back. For about 3 seconds, I thought it meant the job had been approved. Instead, the woman sounded politely distant and told me she had decided to go with someone else. That happens in business. It doesn't always mean anything. But then she added almost apologetically, "I just got a strange feeling after someone reached out saying you'd been hard to pin down lately and had some personal instability." I went completely still. "Who said that?" I asked. "I'd rather not get pulled into anything. Was it a man or a woman?" She hesitated. "A woman." That narrowed it enough. My mother had not just gone emotional and social. She had stepped into my work by way of reputation, likely under the pretext of concern. I could hear the shape of it already. "Tyler's been under a lot of stress. We're trying to support him as a family. He's a good kid, but things have been unstable. Just enough to make a cautious client step away without anyone being able to point to one clean lie." I thanked the woman for telling me and ended the call before my voice turned into something harder to explain. Then I sat in my truck outside a hardware store for a long time without going in. That was the first genuine loss. Not inconvenience, not delay, not pressure. A real piece of work gone because somebody in my family decided my livelihood was an acceptable place to apply leverage. I called Allison that evening. I had not planned to. I did it because by then she was one of the only people near the situation who might tell me the truth if she knew something, and because I wanted to hear whether Logan had been acting like a man under stress or a man laying groundwork. She answered on the second ring. "Hey, has Logan been talking about me to people outside the family?" There was a pause. "That's a very specific opening. Answer it." Another brief silence. Then yes. "How much?" "I don't know everything. I know he's mentioned that you've been unstable, obsessive, hard to trust lately. I thought he was just angry." I laughed once, but it sounded wrong even to me. "That's useful." "Tyler, he cost me a client." I heard her inhale. "Are you sure?" "No," I said. "I'm sure somebody did, and I'm done pretending the coincidences are random." She went quiet in a way that didn't feel evasive. More like she was lining up things she had seen with things she had hoped were unrelated. Finally, she said, "He asked me last week whether people can look up property records easily." That got my full attention. "For what?" "He said he was curious how private addresses really are if someone's trying too hard to hide." I thought he was just being petty. "Anything else?" She hesitated. "He's been more fixated than usual. Not just angry. Competitive, maybe. He keeps saying you think you're above all of them now. He talks about your apartment and your jobs like there's some performance directed at him." That made an unpleasant kind of sense. Logan had always reacted badly to my boundaries because they exposed his lack of them. Now the very existence of my stability had become insulting to him because it disproved the family myth that I had overreacted and doomed myself out of bitterness. "Allison," I said, "if he asks you anything about where I'm working, what I'm driving, or who I'm working for, don't answer." "I wouldn't. I mean it." "I know," she said quietly. "I'm not helping him hurt you." That was the first time either of us had named the actual direction of things, and hearing it out loud made my chest tighten in a different way than anger did. Hurt. not inconvenience, not family tension. Hurt. After we hung up, I called Greg. I told him more this time than I had before. Not everything from childhood, not all the emotional history, but the practical arc of the current problem. My family wanting access, my refusal, the weird work disruptions, the changed messages, the truck, the lost client, the possibility that my mother was making calls under the guise of concern. Greg listened all the way through. Then he said, "You need to stop treating this like family static and start treating it like business contamination." What does that mean? It means you separate lines. New phone number for clients if you need to. New email. Fewer loose referrals. Tell the people who matter that if changes come through, they come from you directly and in writing. You don't need to explain your family. You need to shut down the avenues. That was why I kept trusting him. He always moved toward the practical core faster than I did. I spent the next 2 days doing exactly that. New work email. Cleaner client communication. Clear text confirmations. Notes on verbal conversations sent back in writing. I told Jonah and 2 other regular contacts that schedule changes should never be accepted unless they came directly from my number or email. I changed where I kept my truck overnight when I could. I took photos of the engine bay and cab before jobs when the route mattered enough. None of it felt dramatic. It felt like hardening a perimeter. Jonah noticed. He didn't ask for my life story, but after I finished a late Friday walkthrough at the duplex, he stood with me near the porch and said, "You've tightened up." Needed to. He studied me for a second, then said, "Whatever's going on, don't let it touch the work again." There wasn't much sympathy in the sentence, but there was something more useful, conditional confidence. He was telling me I still had room to recover if I protected the line now. "I won't," I said. He nodded once. Good. By the time I got home that night, there was a cream-colored envelope taped to my apartment door. No stamp, no mailing label, just my name. I took it inside, locked the door, and opened it at the kitchen counter. Inside was a folded card from my mother, handwritten in the careful, neat style she used when she wanted something to look sincere no matter what the contents were. The message was all emotion and pressure. The family was hurting. Dad was exhausted. Logan was trying. I was pulling away from people who still loved me. She hoped I would attend a family dinner the following week, because everyone needed to sit down like adults and stop turning misunderstandings into damage. At the bottom, she had written the address. Not my old house. A restaurant in Dublin. So that was the new strategy. Not just calls, not just pressure, not just work interference. A controlled public setting where they could stage reasonableness and try to pull me back into the shape they preferred, probably with witnesses who would make refusal harder and performance easier. I put the card back in the envelope and slid it into the lockbox with the rest. Then I stood in my kitchen looking around the apartment I had built piece by piece and understood something with complete clarity. They were not trying to fix anything. They were trying to regain control of the story before the damage spread any further. The invitation sat on my counter all weekend. I didn't answer right away because answering too fast would have given the whole thing the shape they wanted. In my family, urgency was often a tool. If they could get you reacting on their timeline, they could keep you from noticing the arrangement around you. A restaurant in Dublin instead of the house. A handwritten note instead of a text. Language about adults and misunderstanding instead of apology and accountability. It was all packaging. By Monday morning, I had figured out enough of the purpose to know one thing clearly: if I went, I couldn't go unprepared. I called Aunt Marlene first. She picked up on the second ring and said, "I was wondering when you'd get around to that." That sounds ominous. It sounds like your mother's been busy. I leaned back in my chair. "You got invited too." "Oh, honey, of course I did. Your mother wants witnesses, preferably the kind who can later say everyone tried their best." That was exactly what I had been thinking, and hearing her say it out loud made the whole thing sharpen. My parents were not setting up a private attempt at reconciliation. They were building a controlled social environment where they could perform reasonableness, frame me as stubborn, if I didn't comply and maybe pressure me into some public concession that would restore their version of events. Who else, I asked? A couple of cousins, maybe. Nobody too explosive. People who know enough to nod along and not enough to challenge anything. I also heard Logan may be bringing Allison. That made me go still. You heard that from who? Your mother, indirectly. She mentioned wanting everyone there who matters. I looked at the envelope still sitting near the fruit bowl. If Allison was there, that changed the stakes. My parents might have wanted a neutral-seeming group for appearances, but Logan would want something else too. If he believed Allison was slipping out of his narrative, a family dinner could be used to box her back in, overwhelm her with consensus, and make me look unstable in front of her. Are you going? Aunt Marlene asked. Yes. She was quiet for half a second. That's either very smart or very dangerous. Probably both. Well, she said, voice flattening into practicality. If you do go, don't walk in hoping they'll suddenly decide to be honest, because there are napkins and water glasses involved. I won't. And don't let them make you sound emotional for remembering facts. I won't. That answer came out more firmly than I expected, and for the first time since the invitation arrived, I felt something like steadiness rather than tension. Not calm, exactly. More like focus. After we hung up, I pulled the lockbox from the shelf in my closet and spread its contents across the kitchen table. Screenshots from my mother. Voicemails. Texts from Dad. Messages from Logan. Dates. Times. Notes. 2 printed photos of the loosened battery cable and the shifted papers in my truck. The altered confirmation message from the client who thought I had changed her appointment time. A printed transcript of the voicemail from my mother accusing me of creating confusion with Allison. A short written timeline I had started building for myself when things first began crossing into work. It looked obsessive for about 5 seconds. Then it looked necessary. People from healthy families sometimes mistake documentation for drama because they assume truth is naturally stable. It isn't when you are surrounded by people who reshape memory to protect themselves. In those situations, records are what let you stay sane long enough to respond cleanly. I didn't plan to dump the whole stack on the table at dinner like some courtroom stunt. That wasn't my style, and it would have played into exactly what my parents wanted, a picture of me arriving armed and theatrical. What I needed was not volume. I needed sequence. A clean path through facts that couldn't be bent without making the bending obvious. So I built one. I arranged everything into 3 groups. The first group was the birthday and its aftermath. Logan's 3-word text. My parents' message telling me not to make a big deal out of what had happened. Their later rewriting of my leaving as dramatic rather than responsive. That was the foundation, the original fracture they kept trying to shrink into one dinner. The second group was the apartment pressure. Mom's coffee shop request. Dad's calls. Logan's entitlement. Their consistent refusal to acknowledge the past while demanding access to my space in the present. That section showed the pattern clearly: no apology, immediate ask. The third group was the escalation. Social media pressure. Relatives reaching out. Allison's questions and the changing stories she noticed. The work interference. The altered messages. The truck. The client I lost after someone described me as unstable. That was the most dangerous section because it moved the conflict out of family feeling and into measurable harm. By the time I finished arranging the pages, it was almost midnight. I sat back and looked at them for a long time. Then I did something I had not expected to do. I called Allison. She answered softly, like she had already been keeping her voice down for somebody else nearby. Hey, I got invited to a family dinner next week. A beat of silence. At the restaurant in Dublin. So she had been invited too. Yes, I said. Logan told me it was supposed to help clear the air. That's one way to describe it. Another silence, then. I don't think he wants to clear the air. Number. I heard movement on her end, then a door shutting, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed. More direct. What do you think he wants? I considered the question before answering, Because by then, every honest response around this family required precision. I think my parents want witnesses. I think Logan wants control. And I think all of them want a version of the evening that can be repeated later as proof they tried. She let that sit. Then she said, "That sounds right. Are you still going?" "I haven't decided. If you go, go for yourself. Not because they tell you it'll fix anything. That's not why I'd go." Her tone held something new in it. Not trust exactly, but alignment on the shape of the problem. I said, "If they start talking like this is about a misunderstanding, pay attention to whether anyone can hold one version of the story for more than 10 minutes. She gave a short breath of humor. "You noticed that too. They can't help it. Their stories change based on what they need from the listener. And what do you need from the dinner?" The question landed more directly than anything else had that week. I looked down at the papers on my table. An ending. She didn't answer right away. Then she said quietly, "Oh, I think I do too." After we hung up, I slept badly, though not in the helpless way I used to after family conflict. This was different. My mind wasn't circling the old question of whether I was being unfair. That question had finally burned out. What kept me awake was logistics. What they might say first. Which version of me they would try to build in front of relatives. Whether Logan would push too hard or my mother would try to turn everything into tears and disappointment. Which facts mattered most. How to stop it from becoming noise. The next day, I took a legal pad to work and used my lunch break to write out short statements, not speeches. Not, "You've always done this." Not, "You never cared about me." Not, "You ruined my life." Just, "You left me alone on my 18th birthday and told me not to make a big deal out of it. You contacted me again only when Logan needed something. You have told different people different versions of why I left. Work has been interfered with since I refused. I'm not here to argue memory. I'm here to state facts. This ends tonight." Plain statements are powerful because people like my parents survive by inflating the emotional mess around a truth until the truth looks equally unstable. If I stayed plain, their options narrowed. Greg noticed something was different before I said a word. We were unloading trim bundles at one of Jonah's properties, and after the second trip from the truck, he said, "You've got a plan face on." That a compliment. It's better than your family face. I almost laughed. "There's a dinner." He set the trim down by the wall and looked at me. "Voluntary." "Yes, that's suspicious." "It is." He waited. I told him the basics. Not every old wound, just the current setup restaurant relatives. Alice and my mother wanting this to look mature and reasonable. My father angry about embarrassment, Logan trying to regain control of the narrative. Greg listened without interrupting, then said, "You going to reconcile?" "Number." "Then why go?" "Because they're going to keep pushing their version in wider circles if I don't stop it cleanly." He nodded once. "Fair." Then he looked at me longer and added, "Don't go in there hoping they'll finally understand you." "I'm not." "Good. Understanding is optional. Boundaries are not." That sentence stayed with me all day. By the end of the week, my mother had sent 2 follow-up messages in the same polished, careful tone she used whenever she wanted to sound reasonable in writing. "I really hope you'll come with an open heart. No one wants conflict. Your father is trying too. It would mean a lot if we could all behave like adults." That last line almost amused me. Families like mine use adulthood like a weapon whenever they want obedience from the person they've wronged. Behaving like adults in their language usually meant suppressing consequences, so the most disruptive person in the room could remain comfortable. I answered only once, "I'll be there." Nothing else. 2 hours later, Logan texted, "Good. Maybe you can stop acting insane for one night." I looked at the message, took a screenshot, and added it to the 3rd stack. By Sunday, the dinner had become a quiet center point in my week. Everything else still happened. I worked. I picked up supplies. I paid bills. I cleaned my apartment. I slept when I could. But underneath all of it, part of me kept measuring toward that evening, tightening details, removing risk, checking my own reactions for weak points. I changed one thing practically too. I asked Jonah to communicate all major scheduling changes for the next week by email only. He raised an eyebrow but agreed without making it a conversation. I also let one regular client know I was cleaning up my communication channels and that any revisions should come directly from me, not by word of mouth. Neither move felt dramatic. Both were necessary. I wanted my work perimeter solid before I walked into a room full of people who treated blurred boundaries like family oxygen. On Tuesday night, Aunt Marlene called again. "Your mother says she's hoping for healing," she said. "What does she really hope for?" A dry pause. "She hopes you'll stop telling the truth in ways that can be repeated." That was why I liked Aunt Marlene more these days than I had when I was younger. Distance had sharpened her. Or maybe my leaving had forced her to notice things neutrality once allowed her to avoid. She also said, Aunt Marlene continued, that she's worried you'll come in angry and make a scene. I almost smiled. That tells me she's already preparing the room. Of course she is. I won't make a scene. No, she said. You'll make a record. I sat with that for a second. That's a very lawyerly thing to say. It's a very survivalist thing to say. Before we hung up, she told me one other detail that mattered. Your cousin Devin was invited, but he's not going. He said he doesn't want to get pulled into another Bennett production. That phrase hit me in the chest because it named the thing with brutal accuracy. A Bennett production. Not a dinner. Not reconciliation. A managed scene with assigned roles and rehearsed emotional outcomes. I wrote it down after we ended the call. The day of the dinner came in clear and humid, one of those Ohio evenings where the air feels heavier by sunset than it did at noon. I worked half a day, came home early, showered, put on a button-down I would have worn for any normal family dinner, and left my apartment with a slim folder in the passenger seat and my phone fully charged. I wasn't dressed for battle. That mattered to me. I didn't want anything about my appearance to feed their script. No visible anger. No overcorrection. No theatrical gravity. Just a man showing up to dinner looking like he had his life together and didn't need the room to confirm it. I parked in the restaurant lot 10 minutes early and sat in the car for a while, engine off, hands resting lightly on the wheel. I thought about turning around once, not because I was afraid of them, because I understood exactly how people like my parents make conflict expensive. They create situations where the truth costs more to say aloud than the lie costs to maintain. You lose peace. You lose the benefit of being seen as easy. You become the difficult one permanently. There is always a final chance to protect yourself with silence. Then I remembered the condo client I lost. The loosened battery cable. The fake schedule change. The social media post. My mother telling Allison I had created confusion. My father calling memory a weapon. Logan standing outside my building like entitlement itself had grown legs. I picked up the folder and got out of the car. The host led me to the back room without asking questions, which told me my mother had reserved something more private than a standard table. Of course she had. Not private enough for honesty. Just private enough to contain fallout. When I stepped inside, every face turned. Mom was the first one up, smiling too fast. Tyler. Dad remained seated, but straightened his expression, already carrying the tension of a man trying not to look defensive in front of other people. Logan sat to one side, jacket off, drink in hand, wearing the version of neutral he thought looked mature. Aunt Marlene was there. So was one of my cousins, a woman named Rachel. I had always liked, because she rarely pretended confusion when a situation was obvious. And Allison sat near the end of the table, not beside Logan, but not far from him either. That detail mattered. Mom stepped toward me as if a hug was expected. I took one small step back and said, "I'm here." That was enough to stop the gesture without turning it into a show. "Of course," she said too brightly. "We're so glad you came." I looked around the room once before sitting down. "You've got quite a crowd for a misunderstanding." The smile on her face tightened just enough for me to see it. Dinner started the way I expected, with performance, menus, water glasses, Questions about work asked in voices too careful to be casual. Dad commenting on traffic. Mom thanking everyone for coming with the tone of someone hosting a charitable intervention rather than a dinner built on years of denial. Logan mostly quiet at first, which meant he had been coached or had coached himself. Allison, polite attentive, watching more than speaking. I answered almost nothing beyond what was required to keep the first 10 minutes from becoming absurdly brittle. I knew my parents wanted to create an opening where my silence looked rude and their effort looked generous. What they didn't seem to understand was that the room already knew too much. Aunt Marlene knew the social media version was manipulative. Rachel had almost certainly heard at least 2 different summaries from different people. Allison had already seen the narrative move under pressure. Consensus was not as intact as my mother thought. Eventually, she did what I knew she would. She set down her fork, looked around the table with a small, wounded expression, and said, "I just want tonight to be honest. It would have been almost funny if it weren't so insulting." I said that would be new. Rachel looked down at her napkin fast enough to hide what might have been a smile. Dad's jaw hardened immediately. Logan's fingers tightened on his glass. Mom inhaled slowly, recalibrating. "Nobody wants to fight," she said. "Then nobody should lie." There it was. Plain, clean, in the center of the table. Dad leaned forward. "That's not how we're starting this. It already started a long time ago." Mom gave me the look she used when she wanted to frame my directness as aggression. "Tyler, this is exactly the tone we were hoping to avoid." I opened the folder, not dramatically, just enough to rest one hand on the papers inside. "Then, maybe don't invite me to dinner so you can call my life a misunderstanding in front of witnesses." The room changed then. Not loudly. More like a current passing through water. Logan sat back in his chair. "Here we go." I turned to him. "You don't get to say that like you're tired of this. You were tired on my 18th birthday too, remember?" That landed hard because it used the exact shape of his original refusal without me needing to explain it. Mom moved fast. "We've acknowledged that night hurt you." I looked at her. "No. You've acknowledged that I still remember it." Then I pulled out the printed screenshot and set it beside my water glass. Logan's text, not in the mood. I didn't push it across the table. I just left it there where anyone near me could see it. "You all keep saying I blew up the family over one dinner," I said. "That isn't what happened. I asked my brother to come. He sent me that. You and Dad didn't show up either. While I was sitting in that restaurant, I got a message telling me not to make a big deal out of whatever had come up at home. That was not confusion. That was a choice." Nobody interrupted. So I continued. "I left because it was clear what I was worth in that house when convenience was on the line. And over the past year, none of you have tried to repair that. You contacted me again only when Logan needed access to something I had built." Dad spoke then, voice tight and low. "That's a distortion." I pulled out the next sheet. Notes from the coffee shop conversation. The timeline of the apartment ask. I didn't need every page in front of me yet. Just enough to show there was structure behind what I was saying. "Is it?" I said. "Mom asked me for coffee. She didn't apologize. She asked me to let Logan move into my apartment. You called after that to pressure me. Logan called after that to tell me I was being insane for saying no." Allison went very still at that word. She had heard it before, Logan noticed. "You're taking everything out of context." I turned to him. "Then give the room the correct context." He opened his mouth, but for once no sentence arrived fast enough. That was when I knew I had them. Not because they were beaten. Because the room had shifted from performance to verification. Once that happens, people who depend on emotional fog lose speed. They can still lie. They just can't lie gracefully anymore. Mom tried next. "We are not denying mistakes were made," she said, hands folded too tightly now. "But family should not be treated like an enemy because of pride." I pulled out the social media screenshot and set that one down too. "No," I said. "Family becomes an enemy when they punish you for not protecting their version of events." Mom's face changed the second she saw the post. Rachel leaned slightly closer. Aunt Marlene did not move at all. I said, "After I refused to let Logan move in, you started posting things about family, choosing family. Relatives started contacting me. Then different people started hearing different versions of why I left. Then my work started getting touched." That last sentence changed everything. Dad's head snapped up. Logan's expression shifted for the first time from practiced annoyance to genuine alertness. Allison looked at me with full attention, now not divided. "What do you mean, touched?" Dad said. I took out the client messages, the altered appointment time, the note about the crew showing up where they weren't authorized, the battery cable photos. Not every page, just enough to establish pattern. "I mean, somebody contacted people connected to my work," I said. "Somebody changed details around jobs. Somebody described me as unstable to a client I lost. Somebody tampered with my truck. Maybe you want to tell the room that was random too." "Now you're being ridiculous," Logan said. I looked straight at him. "You came to my apartment uninvited and told me I should be careful before any of this happened." His face flushed. "That's not what I meant." "Allison," I said, turning to her for the first time. Directly, did he or did he not ask whether property records were easy to look up? Logan's head moved toward her so fast it almost looked painful. Allison did not look at him. "Yes," she said. Silence. Real silence this time. Not social waiting. Not tension. The kind of silence that happens when a room loses the last easy excuse to keep pretending all the pieces belong to different puzzles. Mom found her voice first. And of course she reached for emotion before fact. "Tyler, this is getting out of control." I shook my head. "No, it's getting specific." Dad looked at Logan. "Did you go to his apartment?" Logan laughed once, but there was no confidence in it now. "So what if I did?" He's acting like I planted a bomb. The room recoiled almost imperceptibly from the phrasing, which told me he knew he had chosen badly even before anyone answered. I said, "That's your defense." He spread his hands. "He's been trying to ruin me." Rachel finally spoke, quiet but unmistakable. "By saying no to you." That was the first outside challenge at the table, and it mattered more than any speech I could have given. Logan turned to her. "You don't know what he's been like." "No," Rachel said. "But I know what everyone's been saying, and it changes depending on who's listening." There it was again. The thing Allison had noticed. The thing that breaks manipulative family systems more often than confrontation does inconsistency, becoming visible to multiple people at once. Mom looked close to tears now, which in another family might have made me slow down. In mine, it just meant her safest tool had finally moved to the front of the box. "I cannot believe," she said softly, "that this is what you wanted tonight to become." I looked at her. "I wanted tonight not to happen at all. You invited me here to make this look mutual." No one contradicted me. That was the moment I knew the ending had already begun. Nobody at the table moved for a second. That was the strange thing about truth in rooms built on performance. Once it landed cleanly enough, people didn't always explode. Sometimes they just froze because the script they had been relying on no longer fit the moment. My father was the first one to try to put it back. "This is exactly why private matters should stay private," he said, staring at me as if I had violated some sacred rule instead of simply refusing to lie for him in public. "You took a family issue and turned it into a spectacle." I looked at him, then at the room, then back at him. "You invited witnesses." His mouth tightened. That line mattered because it exposed the architecture of the evening. My parents wanted a dinner they could later summarize as proof that they had tried shit, that I had overreacted, that Logan had simply needed support, and that I had chosen humiliation over healing. My mother tried again, softer this time. "Tyler, please," she said. "You are saying very serious things in front of people who care about all of us." That was the point of inviting them, wasn't it? Her eyes filled, but I didn't stop. "You didn't ask me here to fix anything. You asked me here so you could frame me in front of other people." "That is not true." I slid one more page from the folder and set it down beside the others. The voicemail transcript. The line about me creating confusion with Allison. The line about bitterness. I said, "Then explain that." My mother's expression changed the second she saw her own words in print. "What is that?" my cousin Rachel asked. My mother accusing me of creating confusion because Allison asked questions after hearing 3 different versions of why I left. Rachel looked at my mother. "Did you say that?" Mom didn't answer directly. I was upset. "That's not an answer," Rachel said. Aunt Marlene still hadn't raised her voice once all evening, but when she spoke next, the room shifted toward her automatically. "Denise, you've been saying for weeks that Tyler is holding on to one misunderstanding. That's not what this looks like." My mother turned toward her with actual hurt now. "Marlene, I can't believe you're piling on." "I'm not piling on," Aunt Marlene said. "I'm noticing." Logan pushed his chair back half an inch and looked at me like he wanted the whole evening reduced to a one-on-one fight. "You got what you wanted," he said. "Everybody's looking at me like I'm some criminal now." I said, "No. Everybody's looking at you like a man who got caught lying." Allison had been quiet almost the entire dinner, but by then quiet no longer meant passive. It meant watching. She turned to Logan and asked very calmly, "Did you tell me Tyler reached out to me first?" He looked at her, then at me, then back at her. I said he was the one stirring things up. "That's not what I asked." "No, I didn't say it exactly like that." She held his gaze. "Did you tell me he left because he couldn't handle one ruined dinner?" "It wasn't just one ruined dinner," he said too fast. "I mean, obviously there was tension, but he always—" She cut in. "That's still not an answer." My father turned to her next, probably hoping authority would do what the family script no longer could. "You don't know the full history here," he said. Allison didn't look intimidated. "That seems to be the problem with everyone in this family. Nobody tells the full history." My mother said, "Allison, we were trying to protect everyone." From the end of the table, Rachel let out a tiny breath of disbelief. "By telling different stories to different people." No one answered her. By then I knew I didn't need to keep proving every single point. The room had crossed the line I needed it to cross. They no longer looked like a family trying to save one of their own from an unreasonable son. They looked like what they were: a group of people who had built a system around protecting one person and had become angry when the least protected person refused to keep carrying part of the weight. I closed the folder halfway. "I didn't come here to humiliate anyone," I said. "I came here because all of you keep acting like what happened was a misunderstanding that can be smoothed out if I stop being difficult. It wasn't. You left me alone on my 18th birthday and told me not to make a big deal out of it. Then a year later, you came back only when Logan needed something from me. When I said no, you pushed harder. Then you started telling people I was cold, unstable, and bitter. After that, my work started getting touched. Dad said, 'You still cannot prove he did those things.' I looked at him. Interesting choice. Not 'we didn't do it,' just 'you can't prove it.' That hit harder than I expected." His face closed immediately. My mother made one last attempt to turn the room emotionally. "We have all made mistakes," she said, voice trembling now. "But family is supposed to be the place where people can come back from them." I held her gaze. "Only if the place they're coming back to is safe." Her expression wavered. "Your home was safe." "No," I said. "It was useful. That's different." That landed hardest with Aunt Marlene. She looked down at the table, then back up at my parents, with a kind of tired recognition I had never seen on her face before. Logan pushed back from the table harder this time and stood. "Unbelievable," he muttered. "You've been waiting your whole life for this." I stayed seated. "For what?" "To make me the bad guy in front of everybody." "You did that yourself." He looked ready to say something sharper, but Allison stood too, and the movement cut across him. "Don't," she said. "Don't what?" "Don't act like this is happening to you." That sentence took the air out of him. He stared at her, half angry, half disoriented. "You're taking his side." "No," she said. "I'm taking the side of whichever version stays the same for more than 5 minutes." Rachel let out a quiet laugh then. My mother looked horrified. "Allison, please." But Allison was no longer speaking to her. She was looking at Logan with the face of someone rearranging the past year of her life in real time. "You told me he was dramatic," she said. "You told me he turned one dinner into a family split. You told me your parents kept trying to reach him, and he pushed everybody away. Then every time I asked for specifics, the details changed. Logan's voice rose. Because it's complicated. No, she said. Complicated isn't the same as inconsistent. Dad stood now too. That's enough, he said. This is not the place. I looked around the private dining room at the careful guest list and the performance of civility built around a lie. It became the place when you chose it. He turned back to me. What do you want, Tyler? The question sounded simple. It wasn't. I want this to stop, I said. Mom shook her head immediately. Then stop doing this. I ignored her and kept looking at Dad. I want no more calls asking me to fix Logan's life, I said. No more relatives pulled in to pressure me. No more stories told about why I left. No more comments to clients. No more messages around my work. No more showing up at my apartment. No more pretending this is an open wound you can manage if you just get enough people in a room. I'm done. Mom looked genuinely stunned then. You don't mean that. I do. You're angry. No, I said. I've been angry. This is after that. Dad said, you're talking about cutting off your own family over one long conflict. I'm talking about ending repeated damage. Mom's voice broke. We love you. I believed that she believed it, which somehow made the whole thing sadder. You love the version of me that absorbs things quietly, I said. You do not love the version that says no. She put a hand to her chest like I had struck her. Rachel looked from my mother to me and said softly, That's probably true. Dad turned toward her sharply. This is family. Rachel didn't flinch. Exactly. Logan was still standing, but by then the fight had gone out of him in a different way. He looked at Allison once, and whatever he saw in her face must have finished something in his head, because his tone changed completely. So what he said? You're all just going to act like he's some saint now. No one said that, Allison replied. He wanted this. I finally stood too, but slowly. What I wanted, I said, was one birthday dinner where I wasn't treated like an inconvenience. After that, I wanted distance. You kept refusing to leave me alone. He opened his mouth again, but Allison cut across him before any new version could form. I'm leaving, she said. The whole table turned toward her. Logan stared. What? I said I'm leaving. You're seriously doing this here. She held her purse in one hand, calm in a way that looked more final than emotional. I'm doing this after months of hearing versions that don't match excuses that don't hold, and one too many conversations where your family expected everybody else to carry the weight of your behavior. My mother stood halfway. Allison, honey, don't make a decision in the middle of a difficult night. I'm not making it because of a difficult night, she said. I'm making it because this night confirmed what I already suspected. Logan took one step toward her. You're overreacting. Allison looked at him for a long second, then said, That's what you all say when consequences finally arrive. She walked out, without waiting for anyone to stop her. No one followed immediately. My mother wanted to. My father wanted to preserve the room. Logan wanted to chase her, but also wanted to stay and prove he wasn't the person everyone had just watched him become. In the end, nobody moved. Aunt Marlene stood next. Well, she said, voice dry with exhausted clarity. I think that answers the question of whether this was a misunderstanding. My father snapped Marlene. No, she said. No more of that. Not tonight. She turned to me. You were right to keep records. Then she picked up her bag and left too. Rachel followed after one glance at me that held something between apology and respect. Take care of yourself, Tyler. You too. When she was gone, the room felt abruptly smaller. My mother sat back down first. Her eyes were wet, but the crying still hadn't fully started. My father looked older than he had at the start of dinner. Logan still looked like he believed some version of the night could be recovered if he forced the right framing quickly enough. You think you won, he said. I looked at him and felt nothing I could honestly call triumph. This was never a contest, I said. That's a lie. No, I said. It's just not a game anymore. I gathered the papers I had used and put them back into the folder one by one. Mom said my name once softly. Tyler. I looked at her. I don't know how to fix this. I believe that too. Then don't, I said. Her face crumpled at that because she finally heard what I meant. Not don't try tonight. Not don't say the wrong thing. Don't. Full stop. No repair, no future meeting, no holiday reset. Dad said, "You're making a permanent choice in anger." I picked up the folder. "No, I'm making a permanent choice after pattern." Then I looked at each of them in turn. "I'm changing my number," I said. "I'll keep one email for legal or financial matters if something somehow still exists that requires contact. But beyond that, do not reach out to me. Do not come to my apartment. Do not ask relatives to contact me for you. Do not mention me to clients or people I work with. If you do, I'll document it and handle it as interference, not family." My father actually flinched at the word interference. Mom whispered, "Please don't do this." "I already am." Logan laughed under his breath again, but by then the laugh had nowhere to go. Unreal. I turned to him last. "This is the last conversation we will ever have unless a lawyer is involved." That finally shut him up. I left cash on the table for my own meal, even though I had barely touched it. Then I walked out of the private room, through the restaurant, past the host stand, through the front doors, and into the heavy summer air. Nobody followed me into the parking lot. I sat in my truck for a minute before starting it. Finality has a physical feeling to it when it is real. It's not fireworks. It's more like a door closing somewhere inside your body, and the silence afterwards sounding unfamiliar. I drove home by the longer route, without planning to. Columbus looked exactly the same as it had the day before. Traffic lights, gas stations, dark storefronts, apartment buildings with blue television light leaking through blinds. Ordinary life still moving. When I got back to my apartment, there was no message from Allison, none from Aunt Marlene, none from Rachel. I was grateful for that. I didn't want comfort delivered too quickly. I wanted quiet, so I changed what I said I would change. New number for work and the few personal contacts that mattered. New passwords. A short email account used only for formal contact if absolutely necessary. A message filter that sent unknown family addresses out of sight. A note to Jonah and 2 regular clients that I had updated my contact information, and all scheduling should continue exactly as before through the channels I specified. The next morning, Allison sent one email to the new address Greg already had, because I had forwarded it to her the night before. It was short. "I'm sorry for the way they used your life as leverage. I ended things with Logan. You don't need to reply. I just thought you should know." I read it once and archived it. Aunt Marlene mailed a card a week later. The note inside was brief too. "You were not wrong. Protect your peace. I wish I had said more years ago." I kept that one. From my parents and Logan, there were several attempts over the next month. A voicemail from an unknown number I recognized as my mother's voice within 3 words. An email from my father accusing me of being extreme. One message routed through a cousin saying Mom wasn't sleeping well. I documented everything and answered nothing. After I sent one formal reply to my father's email, stating that further contact outside legitimate legal necessity would be treated as harassment and interference, the volume dropped sharply. A few weeks after the dinner, I also paid for a short consultation with a local attorney. Not because I wanted a lawsuit, but because I wanted to know exactly where the line was, if my family kept contacting clients showing up at my apartment or interfering with work. The advice was simple and useful. Save everything. Put clear boundaries in writing. Do not engage emotionally once those boundaries are stated. If the conduct continues and starts affecting contracts, housing, or safety, then it stops being family drama and starts becoming something a court takes more seriously. Just hearing that from someone outside the whole system helped. It confirmed what I had already learned the hard way: blood does not exempt people from consequences. That was part of the reason I stayed consistent afterward. Not cold. Consistent. There's a difference. I did not spend nights fantasizing about revenge. I did not call relatives to defend myself. I did not post anything online. I worked, documented, and moved forward. Real endings are usually less dramatic than people expect. They're made of repetition. One ignored message. One blocked number. One boundary kept the same on an ordinary Tuesday as it was on the worst night of the year. That's how distance becomes permanent. As for Logan, his fallout looked less cinematic and more real than he probably would ever admit. He lost Allison for good. He ended up back under my parents' roof anyway, which from what Aunt Marlene later hinted became its own punishment, because the old house no longer had the same script available. Once enough people had seen the structure clearly, my parents couldn't keep performing pure innocence without looking ridiculous. Dad and Logan clashed more openly. Mom got quieter in social settings. Family events happened without my name raised much, because raising it risked reopening questions they could no longer control. And me, my life got smaller before it got bigger. That sounds backward, but it's true. When you stop spending energy on a system built to drain you, your life often gets quieter first. Fewer calls. Fewer arguments reheated in your own head at 2 a.m. Fewer invisible demands riding under ordinary days. Quiet is not glamorous, but it is where real rebuilding happens. Work stabilized. Jonah gave me another property after I finished the duplex cleanly and on time. Greg trusted me with more independent jobs and eventually started sending certain people straight to me if the work fit my skills better than the warehouse schedule. I bought better tools one at a time. I replaced the folding table in my apartment with a real one from a used furniture place. I stopped checking the parking lot every time I came home. The space in my chest where family drama used to live did not become happiness overnight. It became room. That was enough. Sometimes people hear a story like mine and expect the ending to be forgiveness, because they confuse forgiveness with virtue and contact with love. I don't. The lesson I got was simpler and more useful. Being related to someone does not give them permanent access to your time, your home, your work, or your peace. Love that only functions when you are convenient is not love you can live on. And if telling the truth about what happened destroys a relationship, the truth was never the thing breaking it. The damage was already there. The truth just stopped helping hide it. I haven't seen my parents or my brother since that dinner in Dublin. I plan to keep it that way.